On July 20th, 1969, at 2017 Coordinated Universal Time, a human being pressed his boot into the surface of another world. The footprint sank approximately 3 centimetres into the fine lunar regolith, leaving an impression so sharp and detailed that it captured the treads of Neil Armstrong's overshoe with the fidelity of a fossil. That single boot print, photographed moments after it was made, became perhaps the most iconic image of the 20th century. It represented the culmination of 8 years of unrelenting effort, the expenditure of roughly $25 billion, the labour of 400,000 engineers and technicians, and the fulfilment of a promise made by a young president who would not live to see it kept. In the 56 years since Armstrong's boot touched that ancient dust, exactly 12 human beings have walked on the moon. All 12 were American men. All 12 made their journeys between July 1969 and December 1972. Since Eugene Cernan climbed back into the Lunar Module Challenger on December 14, 1972, brushing the grey powder from his suit for the last time, no human being has ventured beyond low Earth orbit. This is not a pause. This is not a gap between chapters. This is an absence so profound that it defies easy comprehension. The most technologically advanced civilization in human history achieved the capability to send people to another world, demonstrated that capability 6 times in 3.5 years, and then simply stopped. The rockets that carried those astronauts were dismantled. The factories that built them were converted to other purposes. The workforce that possessed the institutional knowledge to construct those machines retired, aged, and died. The blueprints survived, but blueprints without the human expertise to interpret them are archaeological artifacts, not engineering documents. If you want to understand one of the strangest chapters in human technological history and enjoy this type of documentary, then please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let us begin. The Saturn V rocket remains, to this day, the most powerful machine ever successfully flown. When its 5 F1 engines ignited on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, they produced approximately 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The acoustic energy alone was sufficient to kill unprotected humans standing within close range. Birds in the vicinity were knocked from the sky by the pressure waves. The flame trench beneath the rocket channeled a river of fire that vaporized 300,000 gallons of water per minute, and even this deluge barely prevented the concrete from melting. Each F1 engine consumed 15 tons of propellant every second. The turbopump that fed kerosene into the combustion chamber generated more horsepower than all the locomotives on the 20th Century Limited combined. The engineering tolerances required to prevent catastrophic failure at these energy densities pushed the metallurgical and manufacturing capabilities of the 1960s to their absolute limits. The fact that 13 Saturn V rockets flew and none failed catastrophically during powered flight remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of engineering. The men who designed these engines are now gone. Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist who led the Saturn V program, died in 1977. His deputy, Arthur Rudolph, returned to Germany in 1984. The thousands of engineers and machinists who translated their visions into working hardware spent their careers at companies that have since merged, been acquired, or ceased to exist entirely. When young engineers at NASA attempted to restart production of the F1 engine in the 2010s for potential use in future heavy-lift rockets, they discovered that even with the original blueprints in hand, they could not replicate the manufacturing processes. The problem was not the drawings. The problem was the knowledge that existed only in the hands and eyes and intuitions of the people who had done the work. The original F1 engines required extensive hand-welding of complex internal channels that carried fuel around the combustion chamber walls to keep them from melting. The welders who performed this work had developed techniques through years of trial and error. They knew when a weld was right by the colour of the metal, by the sound the torch made, by the way the puddle behaved. None of this was written down. None of it could be written down. It lived in their bodies, and when their bodies ceased to work, that knowledge died with them. This phenomenon has a name in engineering circles. It is called knowledge atrophy. When a complex technical capability is not continuously exercised, the institutional knowledge required to reproduce it decays and eventually vanishes. The blueprints become hieroglyphics. The specifications become riddles. The artifacts themselves, the actual flight hardware, become monuments to a lost art. NASA has 3 remaining Saturn V rockets. One lies horizontal at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. One lies horizontal at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. One lies horizontal at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Each of these rockets represents a machine that could have sent 3 astronauts to the moon. Each of them will never fly. They are museum pieces now, curiosities from an age of giants, relics of a civilization that could once do things its descendants have forgotten how to do. The question that haunts anyone who studies the history of the Apollo program is not how we reached the moon. That story has been told countless times, in books and documentaries and films. The question that haunts is why we stopped. And the answer to that question is not technical. It is not that we reached the limits of physics or engineering. The limits we reached were entirely human. They were political, economic, and psychological. The Apollo program did not end because we could not continue. It ended because we chose not to. To understand why the United States built and then abandoned the capability to reach the moon, you must first understand the circumstances that created that capability in the first place. And those circumstances were unlike anything that exists today. They were born from fear, sustained by competition, and terminated by victory. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. The satellite itself was a simple object, a polished metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, equipped with radio transmitters that emitted a steady beep, detectable by amateur radio operators around the world. Technically, it was unimpressive. Psychologically, it was devastating. Americans in 1957 had grown accustomed to technological supremacy. They had won the Second World War through industrial might. They had developed the atomic bomb first. They had the highest standard of living, the most productive factories, the most advanced consumer goods. The notion that the Soviet Union, a nation Americans associated with breadlines and secret police and economic backwardness, could achieve something the United States had not was profoundly unsettling. The beep of Sputnik, audible on shortwave radios across America, became a psychological metronome counting out the heartbeats of national humiliation. Newspapers printed maps showing the satellite's orbital path passing directly over American cities. Commentators warned that the same rockets that had launched Sputnik could deliver nuclear warheads. The implicit message was unmistakable. The Soviet Union had demonstrated mastery of a technology that could end American civilization, and America had been caught off guard. The American response to Sputnik was neither measured nor proportionate. It was a spasm of national anxiety that transformed the federal government's relationship to science and technology. Within a year, Congress had created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the National Defense Education Act. Funding for scientific research increased by factors that seem almost hallucinatory by contemporary standards. The message from Washington was clear. The United States would compete with the Soviet Union for supremacy in space, and it would spend whatever was necessary to win. The early years of this competition were marked by repeated American failures and Soviet triumphs. Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space on April 12, 1961. 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard made a suborbital flight that lasted 15 minutes. Gagarin had orbited the entire Earth. Shepard had gone up and come back down. The gap in capability was obvious and embarrassing. 3 weeks after Shepard's flight, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and committed the nation to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the decade was out. The commitment was audacious. At the time Kennedy made it, the United States had accumulated a total of 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. No American had yet orbited the Earth. No spacecraft had survived re-entry from orbital velocity. No astronaut had walked in space. No vehicle had docked with another in orbit. The technological distance between what America could do and what Kennedy promised it would do was immense. The commitment was also almost purely political. Kennedy was not particularly interested in space exploration for its own sake. He was interested in winning a visible victory over the Soviet Union, and the moon race offered something unique. It was a competition the United States could plausibly win, because it played to American strengths in systems engineering and industrial mobilization. It was a competition the whole world could watch, because the outcomes were unambiguous. Either you landed on the moon, or you did not. And it was a competition with a clear finish line, which meant the eventual American victory would be undeniable. The political calculus worked. By framing the moon landing as a battle in the Cold War, Kennedy gained access to funding levels that no pure scientific program could ever have commanded. At its peak in 1966, NASA's budget consumed 4.4% of all federal spending. To put this in perspective, 4.4% of the current federal budget would be approximately $240 billion annually. NASA's actual budget today is roughly $25 billion, barely 1/10 of that peak proportion. The money flowed because the moon landing was not understood as a scientific program. It was understood as a national security imperative. Every dollar spent on Apollo was a dollar spent in the ideological struggle against communism. Every Saturn V rising from the launch pad was a demonstration of American industrial and technological superiority. Every astronaut walking on the moon was a victory in a war that had to be won. This political logic had consequences that would shape everything that followed. It meant the Apollo program was designed to achieve a specific political goal as quickly as possible, not to establish a sustainable presence on the moon. The architecture of the program reflected this priority. The Saturn V was designed for maximum lift capacity, not for reusability or cost efficiency. The lunar module was designed to land 2 astronauts for a few days, not to support extended stays or permanent bases. The entire system was optimized for the sprint, not the marathon. When Neil Armstrong took that first step on July 20, 1969, the political goal was achieved. The United States had won. The Soviet N-1 rocket, the answer to the Saturn V, had failed catastrophically on all 4 of its launch attempts. The Soviet lunar program was in disarray. American flags flew on the lunar surface. The beep of Sputnik had been answered. But the logic that had created Apollo immediately began to undermine it. If the purpose of going to the moon was to defeat the Soviets, and the Soviets had been defeated, then why keep going? This question began circulating in Washington almost before the lunar dust had settled on Armstrong's boots, and the people asking it were not cranks or isolationists. They were budget directors and congressional appropriators and White House advisors, the people who actually decided where federal money went. The peak of Apollo funding had already passed by the time Armstrong walked on the moon. NASA's budget began declining in 1967 and continued declining every year through the early 1970s. The last 3 planned Apollo missions, Apollos 18, 19 and 20, were cancelled before they flew. The hardware for those missions had already been built. The astronauts had already been assigned. The training had already been conducted, but the money was gone, diverted to other priorities, and the missions were scrubbed. The reasons for this defunding were multiple and overlapping. The Vietnam War consumed increasing amounts of federal spending and national attention. The Great Society programs created new domestic spending obligations. The economy entered a period of stagflation that squeezed government revenues. And underneath all of these proximate causes lay a deeper truth. The American public, which had never been as enthusiastic about space exploration as the mythology suggests, had grown bored. The first moon landing drew an estimated 600 million television viewers worldwide, the largest audience for any event in human history up to that point. The second moon landing, Apollo 12, drew far fewer viewers. By Apollo 13, the networks had stopped carrying live coverage of the lunar coast and had relegated the astronauts to brief news segments, a decision they reversed only when the oxygen tank explosion turned the mission into a survival drama. By Apollo 17, the final lunar mission, public interest had waned to the point where some television stations did not bother to interrupt their regular programming. The paradox of Apollo is that its very success contained the seeds of its termination. By making the moon landing look routine, NASA undermined the political justification for continuing. If landing on the moon was just another thing Americans could do, why was it worth $25 billion? The question was unanswerable within the political framework that had created the program. Apollo was never funded because the moon was scientifically interesting, or because lunar resources were valuable, or because humanity had a destiny among the stars. Apollo was funded to beat the Russians, and once the Russians were beaten, the funding evaporated. The decision to end Apollo was not a single dramatic moment. It was a process of gradual strangulation that began while the program was still flying, and continued for years after the last astronaut returned from the moon. But the most consequential decision, the one that truly sealed the fate of American lunar capability, was made in 1970, before Apollo 13 had even launched. That was when the Nixon administration decided to end production of the Saturn V rocket. The Saturn V production line at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans was one of the most sophisticated manufacturing operations ever created. The facility itself was enormous, covering 43 acres under a single roof, large enough to have its own weather patterns. The workforce had grown to over 10,000 people at peak production, machinists and welders and technicians who had spent years mastering the specific skills required to build the most powerful rocket ever flown. The institutional knowledge accumulated in that facility represented decades of learning by doing, the kind of expertise that cannot be acquired from books or simulations. When the Nixon administration announced that no new Saturn V rockets would be ordered, it was announcing the beginning of the end for that workforce. The people who built Saturn V rockets could not simply be kept on retainer waiting for future orders. They had families to feed and mortgages to pay. As the work wound down, they found other jobs, in other industries, in other cities. The skills they had developed dispersed into the wider economy, diluted and eventually forgotten. The tooling and fixtures used to manufacture Saturn V components were equally irreplaceable. These were not off-the-shelf industrial equipment. They were custom-built jigs and moulds and welding fixtures designed specifically for Saturn V parts. When production ended, these tools were scrapped or mothballed. The drawings that documented them were filed away, but the operational knowledge of how to use them, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of manufacturing decisions, began to decay from the moment the last rocket left the factory floor. The Nixon administration had alternatives. The Saturn V could have been maintained in production at low rates, building perhaps 1 or 2 rockets per year to sustain the workforce and the institutional knowledge. This would have cost perhaps $200 million annually at 1970 prices, less than 1% of the Apollo peak budget. For this modest investment, the United States could have preserved the capability to send humans beyond low Earth orbit, could have maintained the manufacturing base and the skilled workforce, could have kept alive the option to return to the moon whenever political or scientific circumstances warranted. This option was considered and rejected. The Nixon administration was pivoting to the space shuttle, a new vehicle designed to make access to space routine and affordable through reusability. The shuttle would land like an airplane and be flown again and again, eliminating the wasteful practice of discarding expensive rockets after a single use. The economic logic was compelling on paper. The shuttle would reduce the cost of reaching orbit from thousands of dollars per pound to hundreds, opening space to commercial and scientific users who could never have afforded the Saturn V. The decision to kill the Saturn V in favour of the shuttle was presented as a step forward, a transition from the expensive and primitive rockets of the past to the sleek and efficient spacecraft of the future. What it actually represented was a choice to optimise for one capability, reaching low Earth orbit at the expense of another capability reaching the moon. The space shuttle was designed from the beginning for a maximum altitude of roughly 300 miles. It could not reach the moon. It could not even reach a tenth of the distance to the moon. The engineering requirements for low Earth orbit and lunar missions are so different that the same vehicle cannot optimally serve both. By choosing the shuttle over the Saturn V, the United States made an implicit decision that low Earth orbit was where it wanted to be. The moon and everything beyond it receded from the realm of practical possibility into the realm of future aspiration. This decision was not made through a national debate or a congressional vote on lunar policy. It was made through the mundane process of budget allocation, through decisions about which production lines to fund and which to close, through the accumulated weight of hundreds of small choices that collectively added up to an enormous consequence. The space shuttle flew for 30 years, from 1981 to 2011. It flew 135 missions. It carried the components of the International Space Station into orbit. It serviced the Hubble Space Telescope. It conducted countless scientific experiments. But it never left low Earth orbit. Not once. And the cost savings it promised never materialized. The shuttle turned out to be more expensive per pound to orbit than the expendable rockets it was meant to replace, and its operational complexity made it more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. 14 astronauts died in 2 shuttle accidents, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003. Throughout the shuttle era, NASA periodically studied what it would take to return to the moon. The answer was always the same. New rockets would have to be developed, new spacecraft designed, new capabilities built. Each study produced cost estimates that climbed into the tens of billions of dollars. Each study was filed away when the funding failed to materialize. The moon receded further and further into the future, always 20 years away, always just beyond the horizon of political commitment. The human cost of this abandonment is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The astronauts who flew the later Apollo missions came back from the moon transformed. They had seen Earth hanging in the blackness of space, a blue marble of life suspended in an infinite void. They had walked on ancient ground, touched rocks that predated all life on their home planet. They had experienced something that no human being had experienced before, and they struggled for the rest of their lives to communicate what they had learned. Harrison Schmitt, the only professional geologist to walk on the moon, returned with samples that revolutionized our understanding of lunar history. He could point to specific spots on the lunar surface where he had collected those samples, describe the context of each rock, explain why he had chosen it over the dozens of other rocks nearby. This kind of field geology, the integration of observation and selection and interpretation that comes from being physically present in a landscape, cannot be replicated by robots. The rock samples that Schmitt collected in December 1972 remain among the most scientifically valuable objects ever returned from another world. For more than half a century, no human hands have collected their successors. The last word spoken on the moon belonged to Eugene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17. Before climbing up the ladder of the lunar module for the last time, he paused and looked out at the stark landscape of the Taurus-Littrow Valley. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the boulder fields. In the distance, the mountains rose against the black sky. Cernan knew he might be the last human to stand in this place for years, perhaps for decades. He did not know he would be the last for more than half a century and counting. His words were chosen carefully, approved by NASA Public Affairs, meant to sound appropriately historic. He spoke of challenge, of hope, of leaving as we came, with peace and hope for all mankind. But beneath the official rhetoric, there was a note of something else. He spoke of returning, of America's challenge of today forging man's destiny of tomorrow. He believed, because he had to believe, because everyone at NASA in 1972 still believed, that this was not an ending but an interruption. The moon would wait. America would return. This was just a pause. 56 years have passed since Cernan spoke those words. He died in January 2017 at age 82, having lived long enough to see the space shuttle come and go, long enough to see proposals for lunar return announced and cancelled and announced again, long enough to realise that the pause had become something else entirely. Of the 12 men who walked on the moon, only 4 remain alive as of this writing. The youngest, Harrison Schmitt, is 89 years old. The final member of that exclusive club will die within the next decade or two, and with him will die the last living human memory of what it was like to stand on another world. The loss extends beyond individuals to institutions. In the decades since Apollo, NASA's culture transformed in ways that would have been unrecognisable to the engineers of the 1960s. The Apollo program was characterised by a willingness to accept calculated risks, to move fast, to learn by building and flying hardware rather than by endless analysis. When problems emerged, they were fixed, and the program continued. The goal was clear, the deadline was firm, and everything else was subordinated to those imperatives. The space shuttle disasters created a different culture, one focused on safety above all other considerations. This was an understandable response to tragedy. But safety culture, taken to extremes, can become risk aversion, and risk aversion, taken to extremes, can become paralysis. Programs that once took 3 years began to take 10. Spacecraft that once cost hundreds of millions began to cost billions. The bureaucratic processes that were meant to ensure safety became ends in themselves, generating paperwork rather than flight hardware. The engineers who had built the Saturn V would have been bewildered by the NASA of the 21st century. In the Apollo era, major design decisions were made by small teams of engineers who had full authority to commit the program. In the modern era, decisions required consensus among dozens of stakeholders, each with veto power, each focused on their own organisational equities rather than the overall mission. The result was a kind of institutional constipation, an inability to move forward that had nothing to do with technical limitations, and everything to do with organisational dysfunction. The contrast becomes vivid when you compare the development timelines. The Saturn V went from initial concept to first flight in about 7 years. The first Saturn V rocket flew in November 1967, just 7 years after NASA formally committed to the lunar landing goal. The Space Launch System, NASA's current heavy-lift rocket intended to enable future lunar missions, was formally authorized in 2010. It first flew in November 2022, 12 years later, and even that flight was years behind schedule. The rocket that reached the moon in less than a decade now takes more than a decade to reach the launch pad. The money tells an equally striking story. The entire Apollo program, from Kennedy's 1961 commitment through the last lunar mission in 1972, cost approximately $25.4 billion in contemporary terms. Adjusted for inflation to 2024 dollars, this is roughly $260 billion. This sounds like an enormous sum, and it is. But consider what that money bought. It bought the development of multiple new rocket stages, the F-1 engine, the J-2 engine, the Saturn IB, the Saturn V. It bought the development of the command and service modules. It bought the development of the lunar module, an entirely new category of spacecraft. It bought the construction of launch facilities, mission control centres, tracking stations around the world. It bought the training of thousands of engineers and the employment of hundreds of thousands of workers. And it bought 6 successful lunar landings that returned 842 pounds of moon rocks and transformed our understanding of planetary science. The Space Launch System and Orion spacecraft, by comparison, have cost approximately $50 billion so far and have achieved one uncrewed test flight to lunar orbit and back. No lunar landings, no moon rocks, no astronauts beyond low Earth orbit. The inflation-adjusted cost of Apollo bought 6 lunar landings. The Space Launch System budget, which is approaching 1/5 of the entire Apollo program cost, has bought one empty spacecraft circling the moon without stopping. Part of this cost difference reflects genuine changes in the economy. Labour costs are higher, regulatory requirements are more stringent. Environmental and safety reviews add time and expense, but these factors do not explain an order of magnitude difference in efficiency. What explains it is organisational, not technical. The Apollo program had a clear goal, a firm deadline, and a single empowered administrator with the authority to make decisions and enforce them. Modern NASA programs operate in a different environment, one characterized by shifting requirements, political interference, distributed authority, and cost-plus contracts that create incentives for contractors to maximize spending rather than minimize it. The cost-plus contract structure deserves particular attention because it represents one of the most perverse elements of the modern American approach to space hardware. Under a cost-plus contract, the government agrees to reimburse a contractor for all costs incurred plus a guaranteed profit margin. The more a contractor spends, the more profit it makes. The incentive is to stretch programs out, to add complexity, to avoid the kind of focused urgency that characterized Apollo. Contractors operating under cost-plus arrangements have no financial motivation to finish quickly or efficiently. They are rewarded for delay. Apollo used cost-plus contracts too, but in a very different political environment. The Cold War urgency that animated Apollo meant that contractors who delayed faced genuine consequences. The entire nation was watching. The president had committed to a deadline. A contractor that fell behind schedule risked not just financial penalties, but reputational destruction. In the modern era, programs stretch for decades without consequence. The Space Launch System has been in development for 14 years and has flown once. No one has been fired, no contracts have been cancelled. The program simply continues, absorbing billions of dollars annually, its workforce distributed across key congressional districts in a way that makes it nearly impossible to terminate regardless of performance. This political economy of space hardware explains much of why America lost the capability to reach the moon. The Saturn V was built to go to the moon. The Space Shuttle was built to sustain aerospace jobs in key states. The Space Launch System was built to sustain the Space Shuttle workforce after the shuttle ended. At each stage, the goal shifted from accomplishing a mission to preserving an industrial base. The mission became secondary to the infrastructure, and eventually the infrastructure became incapable of accomplishing any mission at all. The physical evidence of this decay is visible across the American landscape. At the Kennedy Space Center, Launch Complex 39A, the pad from which Apollo 11 departed for the moon, is now leased by SpaceX for Falcon Heavy and Starship launches. Launch Complex 39B, the other Apollo pad, has been modified for the Space Launch System, but it sits empty most of the time, waiting for a vehicle that flies once every few years rather than several times per year. The vehicle assembly building, where Saturn V stages were stacked together, now contains Space Launch System hardware surrounded by scaffolding, the scene of perpetual preparation that rarely culminates in flight. At the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, the same building that once built Saturn V first stages now builds Space Launch System core stages. But where the Saturn V production line turned out rockets at a rate of several per year, the Space Launch System line has produced a total of 3 core stages in over a decade. The massive manufacturing floor, designed for high-rate production, operates at a fraction of its capacity. The skilled workforce is a shadow of what it once was. The institutional knowledge that built the most powerful rocket in history is gone, replaced by a different workforce building a different rocket in a different way. The tragedy is not that America chose to leave the moon. Choices can be reversed. The tragedy is that the choice was made in a way that destroyed the capability to choose differently later. When the Saturn V production line closed and the workforce dispersed, the United States did not merely stop going to the moon. It lost the ability to go to the moon. The hardware that remained became museum pieces. The knowledge that could have rebuilt that hardware died with the people who possessed it. And now, 56 years later, NASA is attempting to return to the moon through the Artemis program. Artemis has already achieved something Apollo never did. It has sent an uncrewed spacecraft around the moon and back using a new rocket and new spacecraft. Artemis II, scheduled to fly in the coming years, will carry astronauts on that same trajectory, the first humans to leave low Earth orbit since 1972. Artemis III is intended to land astronauts on the lunar surface for the first time since Apollo 17. But Artemis is not Apollo. The rocket is different. The spacecraft is different. The lander is different. The mission architecture is different. Nothing from Apollo can be reused because nothing from Apollo still works. The physical artifacts are corroded or obsolete. The drawings are incomplete. The institutional knowledge is gone. NASA is not resuming a capability that was preserved in mothballs. It is recreating a capability from scratch, at enormous expense, half a century after it was discarded. The SpaceX Starship vehicle, currently in testing at Boca Chica, Texas, represents perhaps the most significant wildcard in this story. Starship is designed to be fully reusable, to land vertically like science fiction rockets of the 1950s, and to carry more payload to the moon than the Saturn V could. If Starship succeeds, it will make the Space Launch System obsolete overnight, replacing a rocket that costs over $2 billion per launch with one that might cost tens of millions. NASA has already contracted with SpaceX to provide the lunar lander for Artemis III, an acknowledgement that the agency's own hardware cannot accomplish the mission alone. But Starship has not yet reached orbit successfully. Its development has been characterized by rapid iteration and spectacular failures, an approach very different from NASA's methodical processes. Whether Starship will achieve its ambitious goals remains uncertain, and even if it does, even if humanity returns to the moon aboard SpaceX hardware, the fact remains that 56 years will have passed between lunar missions. Half a century of capability will have been lost and only partially recovered. The years between 1972 and whenever humans next walk on the moon will stand as one of the strangest interludes in the history of exploration. No previous human capability of this magnitude has ever been abandoned so completely. When Europeans developed the ships and navigation skills to cross the Atlantic, they did not then forget how for 50 years. When humans learned to fly, they did not ground all aircraft for half a century. The moon, and only the moon, represents a destination we reached, departed, and then could not return to for generations. The footprints that Armstrong and Aldrin left in the lunar dust are still there. The moon has no atmosphere, no wind, no rain. The regolith that recorded their steps will preserve those impressions for millions of years, long after all evidence of human civilization on Earth has eroded away. Those footprints wait in the lunar silence, monuments to an achievement and a loss, evidence that humans once walked there and then, inexplicably, stopped coming. The equipment they left behind still stands. The descent stages of 6 lunar modules rest on the lunar surface, surrounded by the debris of human activity. American flags bleached white by decades of ultraviolet radiation, scientific instruments whose batteries long ago died, rovers that carried astronauts across the regolith on the later missions. A laser reflector left by Apollo 11 is still used by observatories on Earth to measure the Moon's distance with centimetre precision, proof that the missions happened, that humans really did go there, that this is not myth or fiction but documented history. And yet for most of the people alive today, the moon landings might as well be mythology. Anyone born after 1972 has never lived in a world where humans travel to other worlds. The moon landings are black and white television footage, grainy and remote, events from before their parents were born. The emotional reality of a human standing on another world, looking back at Earth, has receded into the realm of stories rather than lived experience. This absence has shaped our collective imagination in ways we barely recognise. Science fiction of the 1960s assumed that the moon landings were a beginning, that by the year 2000 there would be lunar bases, Mars colonies, space stations spinning for artificial gravity. These visions were not fantasy. They were extrapolations from the apparent trajectory of human spaceflight, projections that assumed the Apollo program represented a new normal, rather than a temporary peak. The future that those stories imagined did not arrive. What arrived instead was a future where humans remained trapped in low Earth orbit, circling their home planet at 300 miles altitude, as confined as goldfish in a bowl. The International Space Station, humanity's current permanent presence in space, orbits at an altitude where the gravitational pull of Earth is still 90% of what it is on the surface. Astronauts aboard the station do not float because they have escaped Earth's gravity. They float because they are in continuous free fall, falling toward Earth at exactly the rate required to miss it. The station is not a stepping stone to other worlds. It is a destination in itself, valuable for science and international cooperation, but fundamentally limited by its location. You cannot get to the Moon from the ISS any more easily than you can get to the Moon from Earth. The energy requirements are nearly identical. The psychological effect of 56 years without humans beyond low Earth orbit is difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. A generation has grown up believing that space travel means floating in a tin can a few hundred miles up, that the Moon and Mars and everything beyond are destinations for robots, and dreams but not for human beings. The ambition that once sent 12 men to walk on another world has contracted, diminished, become modest where it was once audacious. We used to dream of colonies among the stars. Now we dream of a ticket on a suborbital tourist flight. But hidden within this long darkness are signs of change. The Artemis program, for all its delays and cost overruns, represents a genuine commitment to return humans to the Moon. SpaceX's Starship, for all its spectacular failures, represents a potential revolution in access to space. China, absent from the space race of the 1960s, has now landed rovers on the Moon and returned samples, demonstrating capabilities that only the United States and Soviet Union possessed during the Apollo era. The geopolitical competition that once drove America to the Moon may be rekindling, albeit with different competitors and different stakes. The question is whether this reawakening will succeed where previous attempts have failed. The Space Exploration Initiative of 1989 proposed returning to the Moon and going on to Mars. It was cancelled. The Constellation program of 2004 proposed the same thing. It was cancelled. The Artemis program carries the same risk, the same vulnerability to shifting political winds and competing budget priorities. The Moon has been 20 years away for 50 years now. There is no guarantee it will ever get closer. What would it mean to return? Not just to send a few astronauts for a few days, a repeat of Apollo flags and footprints missions, but to establish a sustained human presence on the lunar surface. The answer depends on what we want from the Moon and what we are willing to pay for it. The Moon contains resources. Water ice in permanently shadowed craters near the poles could potentially be extracted and electrolyzed into hydrogen and oxygen, providing both drinking water and rocket propellant. Helium-3, deposited in the lunar regolith by the solar wind, could theoretically fuel fusion reactors if fusion power ever becomes practical. Rare Earth elements exist in lunar rocks, though probably not in concentrations that make mining economically viable by current standards. The Moon also offers something less tangible, but perhaps more valuable, a proving ground. Every technology that will someday carry humans to Mars and beyond can be tested on the Moon, 3 days from Earth rather than 9 months. Life support systems can fail and crews can be rescued. Habitats can malfunction, and replacements can be launched. The margin for error that does not exist on a Mars mission exists in abundance on a lunar mission. The moon is not the destination. It is the training ground for destinations we have not yet reached. But before we can discuss what returning to the moon might mean, we must first confront what leaving it cost. Not in dollars, though the dollar figures are staggering. Not in careers, though careers were ended and redirected. The cost was measured in something more fundamental: capability. The United States of America in the early 1970s possessed the ability to send human beings to another world. By the late 1970s, that ability no longer existed. The machines that could accomplish this feat had been dismantled. The factories that built them had been retooled or closed. The workers who assembled them had scattered to other industries. The knowledge that made such journeys possible had begun to fade from institutional memory, preserved only in aging documents and the minds of engineers who grew older with each passing year. This loss was not accidental. It was chosen. And to understand why it was chosen, we must first understand what the Apollo program actually was, beyond the mythology and the moon rocks and the boot prints preserved in lunar dust. Apollo was the most expensive peacetime project in American history up to that point. The total cost, when measured in the dollars spent at the time, reached approximately $25.4 billion between 1960 and 1973. This figure requires context. $25 billion in 1969, money is not the same as $25 billion today. Inflation transforms the meaning of numbers over decades, making direct comparisons treacherous. But the economists who study such things have made the calculations. Adjusted for inflation to 2024 dollars, the Apollo program cost somewhere between $260 billion and $300 billion, depending on which inflation metric you apply and which program elements you include. Let that figure settle. $300 billion to send 12 men to walk on the moon and bring them safely home. Divided across the 6 successful landing missions, this works out to roughly $50 billion per mission, or more than $4 billion per astronaut who touched the lunar surface. On a per foot of distance travelled basis, each Apollo mission covered approximately 500,000 miles round trip, making the cost roughly $100,000 per mile. These numbers can be sliced endlessly, and each slicing reveals the same underlying truth. Apollo was phenomenally, almost inconceivably expensive. But expense is relative. The Apollo program's peak year of spending was 1966, when NASA's budget consumed 4.4% of all federal expenditures. 4.4% of everything the United States government spent that year went to NASA, and most of that went to Apollo. Today, NASA's budget hovers around 0.4% of federal spending, roughly 1/10 of what it was at the program's height. The Apollo commitment was not merely expensive, it was a national priority on a scale that no scientific or exploratory endeavour has matched before or since. To replicate Apollo's level of national commitment today would require a NASA budget exceeding $100 billion annually. The current budget is approximately $25 billion, and much of that goes to programs that have nothing to do with human space exploration. The decision to fund Apollo at this level was not driven by scientific curiosity or the romance of exploration. It was driven by fear. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, an aluminum sphere the size of a beach ball that did nothing but orbit the Earth and emit radio beeps. Those beeps terrified the American political establishment. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The space race was not a race to the moon. It was a race to demonstrate technological and ideological superiority in a world where 2 superpowers aimed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other's cities. President John F. Kennedy understood this context perfectly when he stood before a special joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961, and committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade was out. Kennedy did not particularly care about space. Internal recordings from the White House make this clear. In one conversation with NASA Administrator James Webb, Kennedy explicitly stated that the moon program was about beating the Soviets, nothing more. "I'm not that interested in space," he said. "I think it's good. I think we ought to know about it. But we're talking about these fantastic expenditures, and we're not going to settle our problems here on the ground." The moon landing, in Kennedy's view, was a means to an end. The end was demonstrating American superiority. Once that superiority was demonstrated, the means became expendable. This political logic contained the seeds of Apollo's cancellation from its very inception. The program was funded not because humans exploring other worlds was considered intrinsically valuable, but because failing to beat the Soviets to the moon would be a propaganda disaster of historic proportions. Once the race was won, the rationale for continued funding evaporated. Neil Armstrong's boot print on the Sea of Tranquility in July 1969 achieved everything the program was designed to achieve from a geopolitical standpoint. Every mission that followed was, in the cold calculus of national security, redundant. The cancellation happened gradually, then suddenly. Apollo missions were originally planned through Apollo 20. 3 missions remained on the schedule when the cuts began: Apollo 18, 19, and 20. In September 1970, NASA announced that Apollo 20 had been cancelled, its Saturn V rocket reassigned to launch the Skylab space station. In 1971, Apollo 18 and 19 were cancelled as well. The remaining hardware was repurposed or put in museums. The last Saturn V to fly carried Skylab into orbit in 1973. After that, the most powerful rocket ever built would never fly again. The Saturn V represented an almost incomprehensible engineering achievement. Standing 363 feet tall, it remains the tallest and most powerful rocket ever successfully launched. Its first stage, the SIC, generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust from 5 F1 engines, each of which burned 15 tons of propellant per second. The total thrust exceeded 3,300 newtons of force, enough to lift the entire rocket and its payload off the launch pad and accelerate it to 6,000 miles per hour before first stage separation. The entire vehicle weighed 6.2 million pounds fully fueled. It could deliver 130 metric tons to low Earth orbit, or 45 metric tons to translunar injection. Nothing before it had achieved such performance. Nothing since has matched it. The decision to abandon the Saturn V is often described as a choice, but it was more accurately a failure to make a different choice. The rocket was expensive to build and expensive to operate. Each launch cost approximately $1.2 billion in today's money. The factories that produced its components were geared for a production rate that Apollo's cancellation rendered unnecessary. Maintaining that industrial capacity without missions to fly would have cost hundreds of millions annually with no return. The political will to sustain those costs did not exist, so the production lines shut down. Rocketdyne, which built the F1 engines, moved on to other projects. Boeing, which built the first stage, redirected its aerospace expertise elsewhere. North American Aviation, which built the second stage and the command and service modules, merged and evolved and eventually became part of companies that no longer remembered how to build moon rockets. The institutional knowledge bled away through retirements and career changes and death. Engineers who had solved problems that seemed impossible in 1965 took their solutions to their graves without adequate documentation. The loss was not immediately apparent. NASA had the Space Shuttle to develop, a vehicle that promised routine access to low Earth orbit at a fraction of the cost of expendable rockets. The shuttle would fly frequently, carry large payloads, return safely to land on a runway, and be refurbished for reuse. It would make space travel mundane rather than heroic. The future, it seemed, lay in shuttle-like vehicles rather than giant expendable rockets. The Saturn V was obsolete, or so the thinking went, a relic of the Cold War space race, unsuited to the practical workaday needs of space operations. This thinking proved catastrophically wrong. The space shuttle, for all its elegance as an engineering concept, never delivered on its economic promises. Each flight cost roughly $1.5 billion when all expenses were accounted for, far more than the expendable rockets it was meant to replace. The shuttle could reach low Earth orbit and no further. Its cargo capacity to orbit was impressive but not revolutionary. Its refurbishment between flights proved far more complex and costly than anticipated. Most devastatingly, the shuttle killed 14 astronauts in 2 accidents, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, giving it a crew loss rate that no other crewed spacecraft has approached. Meanwhile, the capability to reach beyond low Earth orbit simply vanished. The shuttle could not go to the moon. Nothing America had could go to the moon. If a president in 1985 had ordered NASA to repeat Apollo 11, the agency would have been unable to comply. The rockets did not exist. The factories did not exist. The workforce that knew how to build them had dispersed. America had voluntarily surrendered a capability that it had spent a decade and hundreds of billions of dollars acquiring. The consequences of this surrender extended beyond hardware. A generation of engineers who had built Apollo aged out of the workforce and passed away, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. When NASA began the Constellation program in 2005, intending to return to the Moon by 2020, engineers attempted to reconstruct the F-1 engine design. They discovered that significant portions of the manufacturing process had never been documented. The engineers who built the original engines had made adjustments by hand, tweaking components until they worked, relying on tacit knowledge that lived in their hands and eyes rather than in blueprints. That knowledge was gone. The engines could be displayed in museums. They could not be replicated. This phenomenon, the loss of capability to reproduce something that was previously accomplished, has a name: technological regression. It sounds paradoxical. We assume that technology only moves forward, that each generation inherits everything the previous generation knew and adds to it. This assumption is false. Technologies can be lost, techniques can be forgotten, capabilities can evaporate when the social and economic structures that supported them disappear. History offers abundant examples. The Romans built concrete structures that have endured 2,000 years, while modern concrete degrades within decades. The recipe for Roman concrete, which included volcanic ash that created self-healing chemical bonds, was lost for centuries and only partially rediscovered in recent years. The medieval cathedral builders achieved engineering feats that modern architects struggle to explain, much less replicate, because the guild's secrets that enabled those feats died with their keepers. The manufacturing techniques for Stradivarius violins remain mysterious, despite centuries of attempted reconstruction. The knowledge of how to make certain things fades when the people who hold that knowledge are not succeeded by others who learn from them. The Saturn V represents a case of technological regression so severe that NASA's current effort to return to the Moon, the Artemis program, must essentially rebuild capabilities that existed 60 years ago. The Space Launch System, or SLS, is Artemis's heavy-lift rocket, the vehicle that will carry the Orion crew capsule toward the Moon. The SLS uses modified Space Shuttle main engines, themselves derived from technologies decades old, bolted to solid rocket boosters adapted from shuttle designs. It can lift approximately 95 metric tons to low Earth orbit in its Block 1 configuration, with planned upgrades to 130 metric tons for Block 2. These numbers are roughly comparable to what the Saturn V achieved in 1967. Comparable, not superior. 56 years of aerospace development, and the best NASA can do is approximately match the capability that existed when Richard Nixon was president and the Beatles were still together. The SLS is not a step forward from the Saturn V. It is an attempt to crawl back to where we once stood. The cost of this crawling defies belief. Each SLS launch is estimated to cost approximately $4 billion, when development expenses are amortized across the expected number of flights. This makes the SLS approximately 3 times more expensive per launch than the Saturn V was in inflation-adjusted terms, while delivering roughly the same capability. The Artemis program as a whole, including the SLS, the Orion capsule, the Lunar Gateway Station, and the Human Landing System contracts with SpaceX and Blue Origin, is projected to cost $93 billion through 2025 alone. The total cost of returning humans to the Moon and establishing any sort of sustained presence will likely exceed $200 billion. For this investment, the Artemis program aims to land the first woman and first person of colour on the lunar surface. Worthy milestones, but ones that arrive more than half a century after 12 white men walked there and came home. The first Artemis lunar landing, originally scheduled for 2024, has been delayed repeatedly and is now projected for no earlier than 2026. This date will almost certainly slip further. The lunar-capable version of SpaceX's Starship, which serves as the human landing system for Artemis III, has yet to achieve orbit. The spacesuits that astronauts will wear on the lunar surface, developed by Axiom Space under contract to NASA, are still being tested. Every element of the program that must work perfectly for astronauts to walk on the Moon again remains unproven in the environment where it must operate. Compare this with the pace of Apollo. President Kennedy committed the nation to the Moon in May 1961. The first crewed Apollo mission flew in October 1968. Neil Armstrong walked on the Moon in July 1969. 8 years and 2 months from presidential commitment to bootprints in lunar dust. The Artemis program effectively began with President Trump's Space Policy Directive 1 in December 2017, which redirected NASA's human exploration efforts toward the Moon. As of late 2024, no Artemis astronaut has travelled beyond low Earth orbit. The pace of progress has slowed by a factor of at least 3 compared with Apollo, despite the existence of technologies, materials, and manufacturing capabilities that Apollo's engineers could not have imagined. This slowdown is not primarily a technical failure. It is a political and institutional one. Apollo moved at emergency speed because the nation treated it as an emergency. Resources flowed without the normal constraints. Bureaucratic obstacles were swept aside. Decisions that might normally require years of study were made in weeks. The program operated under the assumption that failure was not an option because failure would mean Soviet supremacy, and Soviet supremacy in space implied Soviet superiority in the technologies of nuclear annihilation. No such urgency drives Artemis. The program proceeds at the pace of normal government contracting, with all the delays and inefficiencies that implies. The contrast becomes starker when examining how decisions are made. Apollo program managers had extraordinary authority to commit resources and direct work. George Mueller, who served as Associate Administrator for manned spaceflight from 1963 to 1969, made the fateful decision to conduct all-up testing of the Saturn V, flying all 3 stages together on the first launch, rather than testing each stage separately. This decision shaved years off the development schedule. It was risky, almost recklessly so by modern standards, but it worked. Today, such a decision would require environmental reviews, safety panel approvals, congressional notifications, and years of bureaucratic process. The administrative infrastructure that now surrounds NASA's human spaceflight programs adds years to timelines without necessarily adding safety or reliability. The workforce dynamics have shifted as well. During Apollo's peak, NASA directly employed over 36,000 people, and contractors employed nearly 400,000 more on Apollo-related work. This vast workforce was concentrated in a handful of locations: Houston, Huntsville, Cape Canaveral, and the facilities of major contractors. A workforce of that scale, focused on a single overriding objective, could accomplish things that a smaller, more distributed workforce cannot. Institutional knowledge propagated quickly. Problems encountered by one team were solved by other teams working on similar challenges a few buildings away. The program functioned as a single organism rather than a collection of disconnected parts. Today's aerospace workforce is larger in absolute numbers, but fragmented across dozens of programs and hundreds of contractors. The engineers working on the SLS boosters in Utah have limited interaction with the engineers working on Orion's heat shield in Florida. The SpaceX employees developing Starship in Texas operate under entirely different management structures and corporate cultures than the Boeing employees working on SLS core stages in Louisiana. Knowledge does not flow freely between these silos. Problems are solved and resolved in isolation. The institutional learning that accelerated Apollo's progress does not occur. And yet, amid all these disadvantages, there are reasons for cautious optimism that did not exist a decade ago. The rise of commercial spaceflight, particularly SpaceX, has introduced competitive pressure and alternative approaches that NASA's traditional contractors never faced. SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, which has flown over 300 times with a success rate exceeding 98%, delivers cargo to orbit at a cost per kilogram that would have astonished Apollo-era engineers. The Falcon Heavy, while not approaching Saturn V capabilities, can lift 64 metric tons to low Earth orbit at a fraction of the SLS's cost, and Starship, if it achieves its design goals, could revolutionize access to space entirely. Starship is designed to be fully reusable, unlike every rocket that has come before. Both the Super Heavy booster and the Starship spacecraft itself are intended to return to their launch site, be inspected, refueled, and flown again within days. The implications of true reusability are difficult to overstate. A single Starship might fly dozens or hundreds of times over its operational lifetime. The cost per launch could fall to a few tens of millions of dollars rather than billions. More importantly, Starship is designed to be refueled in orbit, enabling missions that no existing rocket can perform. A Starship launched from Earth, refueled by tanker flights in low Earth orbit, could theoretically carry 100 tons of cargo to the lunar surface. This exceeds anything Apollo achieved by an order of magnitude. SpaceX's approach to development also differs fundamentally from traditional aerospace practice. The company builds, tests, and often destroys hardware at a pace that would terrify traditional program managers. Starship prototypes have exploded on the launch pad, broken apart during flight, and crashed in spectacular fireballs. Each failure generates data. Each rebuilt prototype incorporates lessons learned. This iterative approach, sometimes called hardware-rich development, or test to failure, accelerates learning at the cost of destroyed vehicles. SpaceX can afford this approach because it builds its hardware relatively cheaply and quickly. NASA, working with traditional cost-plus contractors, cannot. A single SLS rocket takes years to build and costs billions of dollars. The program cannot afford to lose one to a test failure. China's space program adds another dimension to the changed landscape. The China National Space Administration has achieved remarkable progress in the past 2 decades, landing rovers on the Moon, returning lunar samples to Earth, and building a crewed space station in low Earth orbit. Chinese officials have announced intentions to land astronauts on the Moon before 2030. Unlike NASA's Artemis timeline, which has slipped repeatedly, China's space milestones have generally arrived on or ahead of schedule. The Chinese Long March 5 rocket, their current heavy-lift vehicle, can deliver 25 metric tons to low Earth orbit. A new super heavy rocket, the Long March 10, is under development specifically for crewed lunar missions. The geopolitical dynamics that drove Apollo may be reasserting themselves, this time with China rather than the Soviet Union as the competitor. Congressional support for NASA's human spaceflight programs often rises when Chinese achievements make headlines. The prospect of Chinese astronauts planting their flag on the lunar surface while American astronauts remain confined to Earth orbit carries echoes of the post-Sputnik panic that Kennedy exploited to launch Apollo. Whether this competition will provide sufficient political momentum to see Artemis through to completion remains uncertain. The Cold War lasted decades and maintained continuous pressure for American space achievements. Competition with China may prove similarly durable, or it may fade as other priorities intrude. What is certain is that the path from where we are to where we want to be remains treacherous. The systems that must work for Artemis to succeed are still being developed, still being tested, still failing in ways that must be understood and corrected. The money that must flow to complete the program remains subject to annual appropriations battles and shifting congressional priorities. The engineers who must solve the remaining problems are working within institutional structures that reward caution over boldness and process over progress. The political will that must sustain the effort through inevitable setbacks remains fragile, contingent on factors that have nothing to do with space exploration. And yet, despite all these challenges, despite the budgetary uncertainties and institutional friction, and technical hurdles still unclimbed, something has shifted in the past few years. The question is no longer whether humans will return to the Moon. The question is when, and who will get there first, and what they will do once they arrive. To understand why this shift matters, we must examine what was actually lost when Apollo ended. Not simply the capability to launch astronauts beyond low Earth orbit, though that loss was real and lasting. What vanished was something more fundamental, an entire ecosystem of knowledge, expertise, and institutional memory that had been painstakingly assembled over a decade and then allowed to dissipate like morning fog. Consider the Saturn V itself, the rocket that carried 12 men to the lunar surface and remains, more than half a century later, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The F1 engines that powered its first stage each produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. 5 of these engines, burning together, generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The sound they produced was loud enough to cause physical pain at distances of several miles. The vibration they created could be felt in buildings across the Florida Peninsula. Building these engines required solving problems that seemed almost metaphysically difficult. The combustion chamber of an F1 engine experienced temperatures of nearly 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while simultaneously handling cryogenic propellants at hundreds of degrees below zero. The turbopumps that fed fuel and oxidizer to the combustion chamber operated at pressures and rotational speeds that pushed the limits of metallurgy and mechanical engineering. Early development testing destroyed engine after engine in catastrophic failures, as engineers struggled to understand and control combustion instabilities that could tear an engine apart in milliseconds. The solutions they found were not written down in any comprehensive way. The F1 engine worked because thousands of small decisions made by hundreds of engineers over years of development and testing accumulated into a functioning whole. Each decision addressed a specific problem encountered during a specific test. Many of these decisions were never fully documented because the engineers who made them did not realize their choices would ever need to be explained. They knew what worked. Why it worked sometimes remained mysterious even to them. The engine functioned reliably, and in the press of the schedule, understanding why was less important than moving forward. When Apollo ended, the engineers who held this knowledge dispersed. Some retired. Some moved to other aerospace companies. Some left the industry entirely, their specialized expertise no longer in demand. The companies that had manufactured Saturn V components shifted to other work or went out of business. The suppliers who had provided specialized materials and components found other customers or closed their doors. The vast network of institutional relationships that had produced the Saturn V unraveled strand by strand until nothing remained but the rockets themselves, standing in museums, and the documentation incomplete and scattered across archives. In the early 2010s, engineers at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center attempted to understand the F1 engine well enough to inform the design of new rocket engines. They obtained original hardware, including an F1 engine that had never been flown, and several engines recovered from the Atlantic Ocean where they had fallen after completing their work boosting Apollo missions toward orbit. They CT scanned the engines, disassembled them piece by piece, photographed every component, and attempted to reconstruct the design intent behind each decision. What they found was humbling. The engines contained features whose purpose was not immediately apparent. Passages and baffles and injection patterns had been added or modified based on test results that were no longer available. The engines worked, but the engineers examining them half a century later could not always explain why they worked, or why specific design choices had been made rather than alternatives. The knowledge that had produced these engines was not lost in the sense of being destroyed. It was lost in the sense of no longer existing in any human mind. The institutional memory that had allowed Apollo to happen had simply ceased to be. This pattern of capability lost through institutional forgetting repeats throughout the history of Apollo's aftermath. The techniques for manufacturing the ablative heat shields that protected Apollo capsules during re-entry required relearning when NASA began developing the Orion spacecraft. The specialized welding processes used to join segments of Saturn fissile propellant tanks had to be rediscovered and adapted for SLS construction. The organizational methods that had allowed NASA to manage thousands of contractors and hundreds of thousands of workers toward a unified goal had been replaced by procurement systems optimized for different objectives. The most painful losses were often the most mundane. The tooling used to manufacture specific components had been scrapped when the contracts ended. The test stands used to verify engine performance had been dismantled or repurposed. The launch infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center had been modified for the space shuttle, and then modified again for other programs, each change erasing some trace of the Apollo configuration. Rebuilding these capabilities required not merely money but time, and time is the one resource that cannot be purchased at any price. All of this explains why returning to the moon has proven so difficult, but it does not fully explain why the difficulty persists. After all, technology has advanced enormously since 1969. The smartphone in your pocket contains more computing power than all of mission control during Apollo. Materials science has produced alloys and composites that Apollo engineers could not have imagined. Manufacturing techniques like 3D printing allow the creation of components with internal geometries that would have been impossible to machine with 1960s technology. Computer-aided design enables analysis and optimization that once required building and testing physical hardware. By every measure of raw technological capability, we should be able to return to the moon more easily than we went the first time. The answer to this paradox lies in understanding that returning to the moon is not primarily a technological problem. It is an organizational problem, a political problem, and a problem of sustained collective will. The technologies required to reach the moon exist or can be developed. What has proven elusive is the combination of factors that allowed Apollo to succeed: clear and compelling national purpose, sustained political commitment, adequate funding, capable institutional structures, and acceptance of risk. Apollo benefited from circumstances that cannot be recreated. The Cold War provided an external pressure that made lunar exploration feel like a matter of national survival. The American economy of the 1960s was growing rapidly, making large government expenditures politically sustainable. The aerospace industry had been built up by World War II and the Korean War and stood ready to take on massive new challenges. The broader culture celebrated technological optimism and accepted that great achievements required accepting significant risks. All of these factors converged in a moment that produced 12 sets of boot prints on the lunar surface, and then the moment passed. The programs that followed Apollo were shaped by different circumstances and produced different results. The space shuttle was designed to make space access routine and affordable. It achieved neither goal. Each shuttle mission cost approximately $1.5 billion in today's money, far more than the expendable rockets it was meant to replace. The program's safety record included 2 catastrophic failures that killed 14 astronauts and suspended operations for years. The shuttle could not travel beyond low Earth orbit, leaving the Moon and all destinations beyond it unreachable. The International Space Station, the shuttle's primary destination, represented a different kind of achievement. Building and maintaining a permanent human presence in orbit required international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Modules manufactured in the United States, Russia, Japan, and Europe were launched and assembled over more than a decade. Astronauts and cosmonauts from 15 nations have lived and worked aboard the station. The science conducted there has contributed to fields ranging from materials science to medicine. But the station orbits only about 250 miles above Earth's surface, barely higher than an airplane cruises compared to the distance to the Moon. It represents an achievement in sustained presence rather than expanding reach. The political logic that shaped these programs differed fundamentally from the logic that drove Apollo. Where Apollo concentrated resources toward a singular goal, with a fixed deadline, post-Apollo programs spread resources across multiple objectives with flexible timelines. Where Apollo accepted high costs as necessary for rapid progress, later programs prioritized cost control and schedule flexibility. Where Apollo tolerated significant risk to achieve ambitious goals, later programs emphasized safety and reliability above all other considerations. Each of these shifts was individually defensible, a reasonable response to changed circumstances and hard-won lessons. Collectively, they created an institutional culture that could sustain operations but struggled to achieve breakthroughs. The contrast between Apollo-era decision-making and modern NASA practice reveals itself in countless small details. During Apollo, if an engineer identified a problem, the question was, how do we solve this quickly enough to meet the schedule? Today, the question is often, how do we document this thoroughly enough to satisfy all stakeholders? During Apollo, if a component failed during testing, a team would work around the clock to understand the failure and implement a fix. Today, a failure triggers formal review processes that can take months to complete. During Apollo, program managers had authority to make significant decisions without seeking approval from headquarters. Today, decisions that would have been made at the working level often require review chains that extend to the highest levels of the agency. These changes did not happen arbitrarily. Each new layer of process and oversight was typically added in response to a real problem. A cost overrun that embarrassed the agency, a safety failure that killed astronauts, a congressional inquiry that demanded accountability. The accumulated weight of these responses produced an organizational culture that excels at avoiding mistakes but struggles to move quickly. The culture that could land a man on the Moon within a decade of deciding to do so has been replaced by a culture that takes a decade to develop a capsule that resembles, in many ways, the capsule that flew in 1968. This institutional transformation helps explain one of the great puzzles of modern space exploration: why private companies seem able to achieve results that government programs cannot. SpaceX developed the Falcon 9 rocket, now the most frequently launched rocket in the world, for approximately $390 million. NASA's own analysis concluded that developing a comparable rocket, using traditional contracting methods, would have cost between $1.7 and $4 billion. The difference represents not merely efficiency gains from commercial practices, but a fundamentally different approach to program management. SpaceX operates with a single decision-maker, Elon Musk, who can authorize design changes, accept risks, and redirect resources without seeking approval from congressional committees or navigating interagency reviews. The company's engineering culture embraces rapid iteration and tolerates failures that would end careers at NASA. When a SpaceX rocket explodes during testing, the company analyzes the failure, implements corrections, and builds another rocket. When a NASA program encounters a significant problem, review boards convene, reports are written, timelines are extended, and budgets are revised. This is not to say that SpaceX's approach is without costs. The company's work environment is notoriously demanding. Employee burnout and turnover are high. Quality control has sometimes suffered in the rush to meet aggressive schedules. The acceptable risk tolerance for uncrewed cargo missions may prove inappropriate as the company moves to crewed flights. And SpaceX benefits from technologies and infrastructure developed over decades by NASA using taxpayer funds. The company did not create the aerospace industry from nothing. It found ways to operate more efficiently within an industry that government spending had built. But the contrast remains instructive. SpaceX has demonstrated that rapid progress in space transportation is still possible, that the pace of Apollo was not a one-time anomaly, made possible by unique Cold War circumstances. The limiting factor is not technology. The limiting factor is organization, culture, and the political environment within which space programs operate. Understanding this context makes Artemis's challenges comprehensible, even if it does not make them less frustrating. The program is attempting to achieve Apollo-level results while operating within post-Apollo institutional structures. It must navigate congressional funding cycles that encourage spreading work across many states rather than concentrating it for efficiency. It must satisfy safety requirements developed in response to shuttle disasters while attempting to accomplish things the shuttle never could. It must maintain industrial capabilities at contractors whose primary incentive is to continue receiving contracts rather than to complete programs quickly. It must operate within a risk tolerance shaped by decades of avoiding failures rather than accepting them as the price of progress. The rocket that exemplifies these tensions is the Space Launch System itself. SLS is, in many ways, a magnificent machine. Its 4 RS-25 engines, originally developed for the Space Shuttle, are among the most sophisticated rocket engines ever built. They can be throttled during flight, allowing fine control of the rocket's trajectory. They have achieved a reliability record over hundreds of shuttle flights that few engines can match. The solid rocket boosters that supplement the core stage engines provide £2 million of additional thrust each, the same boosters that powered the shuttle but with an extra propellant segment added for greater capability. But SLS is also a rocket designed to preserve jobs rather than to optimize performance. Its use of shuttle-derived components was mandated by Congress specifically to maintain the workforce and facilities that had built the shuttle. This decision constrained design options and increased costs in ways that purely technical considerations would not have suggested. The manufacturing is spread across multiple states to ensure broad congressional support, adding logistical complexity and communication challenges. The workforce includes employees whose experience and expertise are essential, but whose employment depends on the program continuing rather than completing. Every SLS rocket takes years to build and costs billions of dollars. The expendable design means that each rocket flies once and is then destroyed. The program cannot afford to lose rockets in test failures, so testing is conservative and timelines stretch. The very safeguards meant to ensure success make success more expensive and more distant. This is the reality that Artemis must navigate. Not a simple story of visionary engineers held back by timid politicians or of wasteful bureaucrats impeding progress. A complex reality of competing priorities, institutional legacies, political constraints, and genuine technical challenges, all interacting in ways that make returning to the moon far harder than going the first time, and yet the work continues. At Kennedy Space Center, technicians are processing the components for future Artemis missions. At Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, test stands that once fired Saturn V stages now fire SLS engines, the sound rolling across the bayous much as it did half a century ago. At Lockheed Martin facilities in Colorado, Orion capsules move through assembly and testing. At SpaceX's Starship factory in Texas, new prototypes rise from the production floor at a pace that would have seemed impossible under traditional aerospace practice. The people doing this work are not unaware of the ironies and frustrations of their situation. They know that Apollo accomplished in 8 years what Artemis has not accomplished in more than 15. They know that the budgets they work within are fractions of what Apollo commanded in equivalent dollars. They know that the organisational structures they operate within were not designed for the mission they are attempting to accomplish. They persist anyway, because the work matters, because the goal of returning humans to the moon remains worthy regardless of how difficult the path has become. The engineering challenges they face, while substantial, are ultimately solvable. Starship's thermal protection system will eventually protect astronauts through the violence of lunar return. The lunar lander's systems will eventually achieve the reliability required for human rating. The spacesuits now in development will eventually provide the flexibility and safety that Apollo suits lacked. Each problem has solutions. Finding them requires only time, resources, and sustained effort. The deeper challenge is whether the political system that allocates those resources will maintain its commitment through the years required. Presidential administrations change, congressional priorities shift, economic crises redirect funding to more immediate concerns. A program that requires decades of sustained investment operates against the natural rhythms of democratic governance, where 2-year and 4-year cycles encourage short-term thinking. Apollo succeeded in part because it could be compressed into a single presidential administration. Kennedy set the goal. The goal was achieved before Nixon completed his first term. Artemis cannot follow this pattern. The program has already spanned the Obama, Trump and Biden administrations. It will span more before it achieves its objectives. Each transition brings uncertainty, potential redirection, the risk that a new president will cancel an inherited program to make room for their own priorities. What sustains the program through these transitions is, paradoxically, the same congressional logic that makes it inefficient. Because SLS components are manufactured across many states, many senators and representatives have constituents whose jobs depend on the program continuing. This distributed economic interest creates political support that survives changes in administration. The very features that make Artemis slow and expensive also make it difficult to cancel. Whether this political equilibrium will hold through completion remains uncertain. But one factor has changed since the years of drift and indecision that followed Apollo's end. Competition has returned. China's steady progress toward crewed lunar landing capability has introduced an element that American space policy has lacked since the Soviet Union collapsed. The prospect that Chinese astronauts might reach the moon before Americans return there concentrates congressional attention in ways that purely scientific or exploratory arguments never could. The space race has returned, though in a form that would be barely recognizable to the engineers who built Saturn V. Where the original race was a sprint between two superpowers locked in ideological confrontation, this new competition unfolds at a different tempo, with different stakes, and against a different adversary. The Soviet Union was an open competitor, its intentions declared, its capabilities on display with every launch. China operates differently. Its space program advances methodically, each achievement building on the last, each milestone announced only after success is assured. There are no public failures, no embarrassing explosions broadcast to the world. The Chinese approach to space mirrors the nation's broader approach to technological competition, patient, systematic, and increasingly sophisticated. In 2020, China's Chang'e 5 mission landed on the moon, collected samples from the surface, and returned them safely to Earth. This was the first successful sample return mission since the Soviet Luna 24 in 1976, ending a 44-year gap in humanity's ability to bring lunar material home. The achievement demonstrated end-to-end lunar mission capability, proving that Chinese engineers had mastered the entire sequence of operations required for crewed lunar exploration: landing, surface operations, ascent, rendezvous in lunar orbit, trans-Earth injection, atmospheric re-entry. Every step that a crewed mission would require, Chang'e 5 performed robotically. 2 years later, China announced its intention to land astronauts on the moon before 2030. Not as an aspiration or a long-term goal, but as a national objective with committed funding and a clear timeline. The Chinese space station, completed in 2022, provided the orbital infrastructure for deep space operations. Development of the Long March 10 rocket, specifically designed for lunar missions, proceeded on schedule. The Mengzhou crew spacecraft and Lanyu lunar lander moved through testing phases. What had seemed speculative became increasingly concrete. American officials initially expressed confidence that Artemis would reach the moon first. The program had a head start, after all. Development had been underway since the early 2010s. SLS had already flown successfully. Orion had demonstrated its capabilities. Yet as deadline after deadline slipped, that confidence wavered. By late 2024, the Artemis timeline showed Americans returning to the moon in 2027 at the earliest, with significant risk of further delays. The Chinese timeline remained 2030 or before. The gap that had seemed comfortable began to narrow. This is not a situation American policymakers had anticipated. For 3 decades after Apollo, the United States was the only nation that had landed humans on another world. That achievement seemed so far beyond any competitor's reach that its permanence was assumed. The Soviet lunar program had collapsed with the Soviet state itself. The European space program focused on satellites and science rather than human exploration. Japan and India conducted modest robotic missions. No other nation even attempted crewed spaceflight until China's first astronaut reached orbit in 2003. Even then, China's capabilities seemed decades behind. The Shenzhou spacecraft was based on Russian Soyuz technology. Chinese rockets lagged in payload capacity. The expertise required to send humans to the moon and return them safely was thought to be so specialized, so hard-won, that replicating it would require the same massive investment and concentrated effort that Apollo had demanded. No nation was prepared to make that investment, or so the assumption ran. The assumption proved wrong. China made the investment. Not with Apollo's crash program intensity, but with something potentially more sustainable. Steady, incremental progress year after year, decade after decade. Each achievement unlocked the next. Each capability served as foundation for further development. The pace was slower than Apollo's sprint, but the direction was unmistakable, and the momentum never wavered. Where American space policy lurched between administrations, Chinese space policy maintained consistency. Where American budgets fluctuated with political winds, Chinese budgets grew predictably. Where American capabilities atrophied through decades of neglect, Chinese capabilities accumulated. The implications of this trajectory extend beyond questions of national prestige. The moon is not merely a destination for symbolic visits. Its south polar regions contain water ice in permanently shadowed craters, a resource that could be converted into rocket fuel, breathing oxygen, and drinking water for sustained human presence. Whoever establishes infrastructure to access and utilize this resource gains significant advantage in the future of space operations. Lunar water could enable refueling stations that dramatically reduce the cost of missions throughout the solar system. A nation with established lunar infrastructure would have capabilities that a nation without such infrastructure could not easily match. International space law, established when humanity's reach was limited to Earth orbit, provides little clarity on resource rights. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits national appropriation of celestial bodies, but does not clearly address commercial resource extraction. The United States passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015, asserting that American citizens may engage in commercial extraction of space resources. China has not formally accepted this interpretation. The legal framework for lunar development remains contested, which means that practical presence may matter more than legal arguments. This is the context in which Artemis operates, and the context that sustains political support through its difficulties. The goal is no longer simply to return to the moon. The goal is to return before China arrives, to establish American presence and precedent, to ensure that the rules governing lunar development reflect American interests and values. Whether this competitive framing is the right way to think about space exploration is a question with no simple answer. The original space race produced Apollo's achievements, but also distorted space policy for decades afterward, creating systems optimized for demonstration rather than sustainability. A second space race might produce similar distortions, yet competition has also revived ambition. Artemis exists, with its budget and its bureaucracy and its actual hardware, because China's progress made returning to the moon a national priority rather than a scientific curiosity. SpaceX develops Starship at unprecedented pace, in part because the company recognizes a window of opportunity that may not remain open indefinitely. Blue Origin accelerates its lunar lander program for similar reasons. The competitive pressure that made Apollo possible has returned, though in altered form, and has energized development that might otherwise have continued to drift. The strategic significance of the Moon extends beyond water ice and legal precedent. Unlike low Earth orbit, where spacecraft complete an orbit every 90 minutes and ground stations can maintain regular contact, lunar distance introduces communication delays of over a second each way and long periods out of direct Earth contact. Mastering operations at lunar distance requires capabilities that directly translate to operations throughout the inner solar system. The Moon is a proving ground, a place where the technologies and techniques for deep space operations can be developed and refined within a few days' travel from Earth. Whatever nation develops robust lunar operational capability will be positioned to extend that capability outward. This is why NASA's Artemis architecture includes plans for a lunar space station, the Gateway, orbiting the Moon in a highly elliptical path that minimizes fuel requirements for landing missions. Gateway would serve as a way station for crews travelling to and from the lunar surface, as a platform for scientific instruments studying the Moon and deep space, and as a demonstration of sustainable deep space infrastructure. The station represents thinking beyond flags and footprints, beyond the Apollo model of brief visits, toward permanent presence that builds upon itself. But Gateway's development has proven as challenging as every other element of Artemis. The station requires international partnerships, which means coordinating schedules and capabilities across multiple space agencies. Components must survive the radiation environment beyond Earth's magnetosphere, which provides none of the protection that low Earth orbit stations enjoy. Propulsion systems must maintain the station's unusual orbit with minimal fuel consumption. Life support must function reliably for crews that cannot be quickly evacuated to Earth if systems fail. Every requirement drives complexity, and complexity drives cost and schedule. The lunar surface itself presents challenges that robotic missions can survive but crewed missions cannot accept. Lunar dust, fine as powder and sharp as broken glass, worked its way into every mechanism Apollo astronauts brought to the surface. Spacesuit joints stiffened. Equipment overheated as dust coatings reduced radiator effectiveness. Astronauts who tracked dust into the lunar module reported throat irritation from particles floating in the cabin atmosphere. 3-day missions tolerated these effects. Missions lasting weeks or months would need solutions that Apollo never developed. The lunar radiation environment poses risks that short missions could accept, but extended missions cannot. Beyond Earth's magnetosphere, astronauts would be exposed to the steady flux of galactic cosmic rays and the unpredictable threat of solar particle events. During a major solar storm, radiation doses could reach levels that cause acute symptoms and measurably increase lifetime cancer risk. Apollo missions rolled the dice on solar weather, accepting the small probability of a major event during their brief surface stays. Sustainable lunar presence requires either hardened shelters, reliable early warning systems, or both. Temperature extremes at most lunar locations swing from over 250 degrees Fahrenheit in sunlight to minus 280 degrees Fahrenheit in darkness, a 500-degree range that strains materials and systems. Only in certain areas near the poles, where the sun angle remains low and crater rims provide shade, do temperatures moderate enough to make extended surface operations feasible. These same polar regions happen to contain the water ice deposits that make sustained presence possible, which is why Artemis targets the lunar South Pole rather than the equatorial regions Apollo explored. But landing in polar terrain is more challenging than landing on the relatively flat mare surfaces where Apollo touched down. Crater rims, boulder fields, and deep shadows complicate navigation and landing site selection. Each of these challenges has solutions. Engineers have designed dust mitigation systems and are testing new spacesuit configurations. Radiation shelter concepts have been analysed and could be implemented. Thermal control systems can be designed for polar conditions. Landing systems with advanced sensors can navigate challenging terrain. None of these problems is beyond humanity's technical capability to solve, but solving them requires sustained effort over years, and sustained effort requires sustained funding, and sustained funding requires sustained political will. This is where the Apollo comparison becomes most painful. When Kennedy committed the nation to landing on the Moon, he also committed to providing the resources that goal required. Annual NASA budgets during the peak. Apollo years consumed 4 to 5% of federal spending, a level of investment that no subsequent administration has been willing to match. Artemis operates on roughly 0.5% of federal spending, a fraction that seems generous only when compared to the even smaller budgets of the shuttle era's final years. The ambition remains similar to Apollo's ambition. The resources are a fraction of Apollo's resources. The gap between ambition and resources manifests as stretched schedules, deferred capabilities, and programs that attempt to accomplish transformational goals with incremental means. Consider what Apollo's budget, in inflation-adjusted terms, would provide today. At its peak, the program consumed approximately $50 billion per year in 2024 dollars. Sustained over a decade, this would provide $500 billion for human space exploration. What could $500 billion accomplish? Accelerated development of multiple rocket and spacecraft designs, providing redundancy and competition, a fleet of lunar landers rather than a single developmental vehicle. Extensive surface infrastructure built up over multiple missions, research and development into advanced propulsion systems that could dramatically reduce transit times, training programs that rebuild the specialized workforce that has declined since Apollo's end. Instead, Artemis receives approximately $8 billion per year for human exploration, less than 1/6 of Apollo equivalent funding. This must cover not only lunar programs, but also continued operations of the International Space Station and various technology development initiatives. The program accomplishes what it can within these constraints, which is far less than what would be possible with genuine national commitment. The question of whether such commitment is appropriate is separate from the question of whether its absence has consequences. Americans who lived through the 1960s made sacrifices for Apollo that today's citizens have not been asked to make. Other priorities competed for funding then as now. The decision to prioritize lunar exploration represented a choice, not an inevitability. Perhaps the resources that went to Apollo could have been better spent on education, infrastructure, or addressing social needs that the tumultuous 1960s generated in abundance. These are legitimate questions without objective answers. But the question this documentary explores is different. The question is not whether Apollo's investment was wise. The question is whether the capability that investment created has been preserved or squandered, and what it would take to rebuild what was lost. And the answer, after examining the evidence across 60 years of history, is clear. The capability was squandered. Rebuilding it will require investment that the political system has not been willing to provide, and may require it for decades rather than years. The evidence for this conclusion surrounds us. In 1969, American industry could build rockets capable of sending humans to the moon. In 2024, American industry is still working to rebuild that capability. In 1969, American astronauts could walk on the lunar surface in suits designed for the task. In 2024, new suits are still in development. In 1969, American engineers could design and build spacecraft that operated reliably at lunar distance. In 2024, Orion has flown once around the moon, without crew, and the systems required for crewed landing remain in development. 55 years of continuous technological advance have not replaced what a single decade of focused effort created. The machines that took Americans to the moon no longer exist. The factories that built them have been repurposed or demolished. The engineers who designed them have retired or died. The organizational structures that coordinated their work have been disbanded and scattered. What remains are documents, artifacts in museums, and lessons that must be relearned through painful experience. The knowledge is not entirely gone, but it is diffuse, scattered across aging files and memories, harder to access than it would be had continuity been maintained. SpaceX represents one path to rebuilding lost capability, a path that bypasses the institutional structures that have struggled to perform. By starting fresh, with new designs and new manufacturing approaches and new organizational culture, the company has achieved development velocity that NASA's traditional contractors cannot match. But SpaceX's success also highlights the difficulty of reforming established institutions. NASA has tried, repeatedly, to encourage new approaches within its existing contractor relationships. The results have been mixed at best. Practices optimized for cost-plus contracts resist adaptation to fixed-price arrangements. Workforces trained in traditional methods struggle with rapid iteration philosophies. Safety cultures developed over decades cannot be transformed overnight. The deeper problem is that space capability depends on continuous practice. Knowledge that is not actively used atrophies. Skills that are not regularly exercised decline. Organizations that do not perform their core mission lose the ability to perform it. This is why the gap between Apollo 17's departure in December 1972 and Artemis's arrival, whenever that occurs, matters so profoundly. It is not merely time that has passed, it is capability that has eroded, experience that has been lost, and institutional memory that has faded. Human spaceflight is not like other engineering disciplines. Building a bridge uses principles that have been understood and practiced continuously since antiquity. Designing an aircraft draws on a century of unbroken development. But crewed lunar missions happened for 3 years, then stopped for more than half a century. The engineers who must build the next lunar landers cannot simply continue the work their predecessors were doing. They must rediscover how that work was done, adapt those discoveries to modern technology and modern constraints, and verify that their adaptations actually function in an environment where errors can kill. This is why Artemis takes so long, not because the engineering is impossible, and not only because the funding is inadequate, but because the program must reconstruct capabilities that would have been preserved had operations continued. Every system must be designed, built, tested, and validated. Every process must be developed from principles that have been partially forgotten. Every organization must learn or relearn how to perform functions that previous organizations performed routinely. The program is not building on a foundation of continuous experience. It is rebuilding atop ruins. The tragedy is that this outcome was not inevitable. It resulted from choices made by specific people at specific moments to accept capability loss in exchange for short-term savings or competing priorities. Each choice seemed reasonable at the time. Each choice contributed to a cumulative outcome that no one intended. The result is that Americans who walked on the moon 55 years ago now watch as their grandchildren struggle to repeat what they accomplished. But struggle is not failure. The work continues despite its difficulties. Artemis II will carry astronauts around the moon, testing systems and procedures that Artemis III will use for landing. The Starship lunar lander, for all its developmental challenges, advances through each test flight toward eventual certification. International partners contribute modules for gateway and instruments for surface operations. Commercial companies develop capabilities that NASA can procure rather than build. The path forward exists, even if it is longer and harder than it needed to be. What Artemis cannot replicate is Apollo's emotional intensity, its sense of national purpose concentrated into a single audacious goal. The cultural moment that made Apollo possible cannot be reconstructed by policy decisions or budget allocations. That moment emerged from specific historical circumstances, from Cold War pressures and post-Sputnik anxieties, and a young president's ambition, circumstances that have not recurred and may never recur in the same configuration. Artemis must accomplish its goals without the tailwind of national mobilization, relying instead on sustained professional effort over years and administrations. Perhaps this is healthier than the boom and bust pattern Apollo established. Perhaps a program that can survive multiple presidents and economic cycles will prove more sustainable than a program that required unsustainable national intensity. Perhaps the slower pace and reduced drama of Artemis will yield infrastructure that outlasts the flags and footprints that Apollo left behind. These are possibilities, not certainties. They depend on political commitments that have proven fragile over 5 decades of space policy oscillation. What remains certain is that the moon is still there, waiting. Its ancient surface preserves the footprints that Armstrong and Aldrin pressed into the regolith, undisturbed by the wind and weather that would have erased them on Earth within days. The descent stages of 6 lunar modules still stand where they landed, their gold foil reflecting sunlight that human eyes have not witnessed in half a century. The experiments left behind continue transmitting data to antennas on Earth, though their power sources have long since faded. The rovers that traversed the surface sit immobile, their batteries dead, their instruments silent, memorials to capabilities that once existed and then were allowed to decay. The next visitors to these sites will find them changed only by the slow accumulation of micrometeorite impacts and cosmic ray degradation. They will see footprints still sharp in soil that has no atmosphere to blur their edges. They will see equipment preserved as if in a museum, protected by vacuum from the decay that time imposes on Earth. And they will confront in the contrast between what they see and how long it took them to return. the full measure of what was lost in the decades between Apollo's ending and Artemis's beginning. Whether those next visitors will be Americans arriving before China, or Chinese arriving before Americans return, or some other sequence of national achievements, remains to be determined by events that are still unfolding. The race is real, even if its terms differ from the original space race that propelled Apollo. The outcome matters, even if reasonable people disagree about how much it matters, or why. What is certain is that humans will return to the moon. The only questions are when, and representing which flag, and whether the capabilities required for that return will be sustained after the first landings, or allowed to atrophy as they did before. The cost of returning to the moon is not primarily measured in dollars, though dollars are the currency in which the discussion most often occurs. It is measured in the accumulated weight of decisions, in the compounding interest that accrues when capabilities are abandoned, in the premium that must be paid to rediscover what was once known and rebuild what was once possessed. But dollars provide a concrete language for understanding abstract loss, and so dollars are where any serious examination must begin. When John F. Kennedy proposed landing a man on the moon before the decade was out, he committed the United States to an expenditure whose final scale he could not have precisely estimated. The proposal was bold precisely because the technical path was uncertain, the costs unknown, the duration of the effort extending beyond his own potential tenure. What emerged from that commitment, once all the contractors were paid and all the facilities built and all the missions flown, was a program that consumed approximately $25 billion over its operational lifetime, $25 billion in 1969 currency, the year Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. That figure requires translation to be comprehensible in modern terms. Inflation calculators provide the mechanical conversion, but they cannot capture the fuller meaning of what $25 billion represented in an economy one-fifth the size of the current American economy. They cannot convey what it meant for a nation to direct roughly 4% of its federal budget toward a single technological goal for multiple consecutive years. They cannot communicate the magnitude of redirected talent, the thousands of engineers and scientists and skilled technicians whose professional lives were reshaped by the decision to pursue the moon. Adjusted for inflation alone, those $25 billion 1969 dollars translate to approximately $200 billion current dollars. This is the simple mathematical conversion, the number that results when you apply the consumer price index to historical expenditure. But this number understates the real equivalent investment by failing to account for the growth in GDP that occurred over the intervening decades. As a percentage of economic output, Apollo's cost would translate to something closer to $300 billion current dollars, perhaps higher depending on the methodology employed. The Artemis program, by comparison, has already consumed approximately $100 billion in development costs for SLS and Orion alone. With Gateway, the human landing system, spacesuits, and lunar surface systems adding tens of billions more. Total expenditure through the first crewed landing, when it eventually occurs, will likely approach or exceed $200 billion. For this investment, NASA will achieve what Apollo achieved with its first mission attempt, landing humans on the lunar surface. The cost per landing has increased dramatically, even as the capability to perform multiple landings in rapid succession has disappeared entirely. This comparison invites a question that sounds almost accusatory. How can it cost more to do something the second time, when the hard work of invention has already been completed? The question assumes that the second time benefits from the first, that knowledge accumulates and efficiency improves and costs decline along a learning curve. This assumption holds true in most domains of human endeavour. It does not hold true when the first time is separated from the second by 5 decades of discontinued practice. The knowledge that built Apollo exists in forms that cannot simply be downloaded into current programs. It exists in archives, certainly, in the millions of pages of technical documentation that NASA preserved and that historians have studied. But documentation records what was done, not necessarily why it was done or how the people who did it thought about the problems they solved. The tacit knowledge, the intuitions developed through years of hands-on experience, the shortcuts and workarounds that never made it into formal reports, these died with the engineers who possessed them, or faded from memory as those engineers aged into retirement. Consider the F1 engine, the most powerful single-nozzle liquid-fueled rocket engine ever flown. 5 of these engines powered the Saturn V's first stage, producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust, lifting the entire stack off the pad with the force of a small nuclear detonation sustained for 2.5 minutes. The F-1 worked. It worked reliably, launching 13 Saturn V rockets without a single engine failure. But the process by which Rocketdyne engineers made it work involved countless iterative adjustments, solutions to combustion instability problems that emerged only during testing and were resolved through trial and error rather than theoretical prediction. When NASA and industry partners examined the possibility of reviving the F-1 for future heavy-lift vehicles, they discovered that the blueprints alone were insufficient. The original engine had been hand-built by craftsmen whose individual techniques varied, whose adjustments were sometimes made on the shop floor without formal documentation. Tolerances that worked in 1965 manufacturing would not necessarily translate to modern manufacturing processes. The institutional knowledge of how to build an F-1 had dispersed, the workforce had died or retired, and the manufacturing infrastructure had been dismantled. Recreating the engine would require essentially re-engineering it from first principles, using the original as inspiration rather than template. The cost would approach or exceed the cost of designing a new engine from scratch. This pattern repeated across virtually every major Apollo system. The command module's heat shield used a material called avcoat, an ablative compound that protected astronauts during the violent friction of re-entry. Avcoat worked well, demonstrating excellent thermal protection across multiple missions. When NASA sought to apply avcoat to the Orion capsule, which is substantially larger than the Apollo command module and requires correspondingly larger heat shield coverage, the original manufacturing process proved impossible to replicate. The suppliers who made the original components no longer existed. The specific formulations had been proprietary and were partially lost. NASA spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing a new version of avcoat that could be applied to Orion's larger surface area, essentially reinventing the technology rather than simply scaling it. The lunar module required complete redesign rather than any form of revival. Its structural margins were so tight, its systems so optimized for the specific Apollo mission profile, that scaling it for longer surface stays or different landing sites would have required redesigning virtually every subsystem. The modern human landing system, whether SpaceX's Starship variant or any competing design, shares almost no heritage with the lunar module beyond the basic concept of a vehicle that descends to the lunar surface and returns astronauts to orbit. The LM's institutional knowledge contributed nothing meaningful to HLS development, because HLS represents fundamentally different design choices made for fundamentally different mission requirements. This is the true cost of the gap, not merely the dollars spent rebuilding capabilities, but the discovery that rebuilding often costs more than building originally cost. The learning that went into Apollo cannot be directly applied to Artemis, because the context has changed too profoundly. Manufacturing techniques have evolved, materials have been superseded, computer systems that once filled entire rooms now fit in a pocket, requiring completely different design philosophies. The Saturn V's guidance computer had less computing power than a modern greeting card that plays music when opened. Modern spacecraft computers are designed around entirely different architectures with entirely different failure modes. What NASA purchases with Artemis expenditure is not the knowledge Apollo generated, but rather the recreation of knowledge that Apollo's termination erased. This recreation is more expensive because it must be accomplished with a workforce trained in different methods, using facilities built for different purposes, within a regulatory environment that did not exist in the 1960s. The safety requirements alone add billions to development costs. Apollo astronauts accepted risks that would be unacceptable to modern program managers and congressional overseers. The loss of crew would not end the program today, but it would trigger investigations and reviews and redesigns that would add years to the schedule and billions to the budget. The political logic that funded Apollo and then defunded it emerges from this cost analysis with terrible clarity. Apollo was funded because its benefits were perceived to justify its extraordinary costs. Those benefits were not primarily scientific, though science resulted. They were not primarily technological, though technology advanced. They were strategic and symbolic, demonstrating American superiority in a domain where Soviet superiority had seemed inevitable. Once that demonstration was achieved, once Americans walked on the moon and returned safely and did so repeatedly while the Soviet lunar program collapsed in failure, the strategic benefit had been captured. Continuing to pay Apollo-level cost for diminishing strategic returns became politically indefensible. The decision to end Apollo was not a decision to abandon the Moon permanently. It was a decision that further lunar exploration did not justify further Apollo-scale expenditure. The Nixon administration assumed that future technologies would make lunar access cheaper, that the space shuttle would reduce costs to low Earth orbit, and that follow-on programs would eventually extend human presence beyond. This assumption proved wrong, catastrophically wrong, but it was not unreasonable given the information available in 1972. The shuttle was expected to fly frequently and cheaply, amortizing its development costs across hundreds of missions. Instead, it flew rarely and expensively, consuming budgets that might otherwise have supported beyond-Earth orbit exploration. Each subsequent administration inherited the consequences of its predecessors' decisions, while making new decisions that would shape its successors' options. The first Bush administration proposed a return to the Moon as part of the Space Exploration Initiative, a program that never advanced beyond paper studies. The Clinton administration focused on the International Space Station, absorbing available budget and management attention. The second Bush administration proposed the Constellation program, which was subsequently cancelled by the Obama administration. The Obama administration proposed a journey to an asteroid, which generated little enthusiasm and was never funded for implementation. The Trump administration proposed Artemis, which the Biden administration continued and the current administration has now inherited. This pattern of oscillation reveals something fundamental about how American democracy interacts with long-duration technical programs. Presidents serve 4-year terms, 8 at most. Congressional priorities shift with each election cycle. The political benefits of announcing new space initiatives accrue immediately. The political costs of cancelling those initiatives are borne by successors years later. The incentive structure rewards bold announcements and punishes sustained commitment. A president who announces a return to the Moon receives credit for vision. A president who actually accomplishes a return to the Moon, if such a return requires more than 8 years, receives no credit whatsoever, because they will no longer be in office when the landing occurs. Apollo succeeded despite this incentive structure, because its timeline was compressed. Kennedy announced the goal in May 1961. Armstrong achieved the goal in July 1969, 8 years and 2 months, spanning 3 presidencies but achievable within 2. Kennedy received posthumous credit for the vision. Nixon received credit for the achievement. The political rewards aligned with the program timeline barely. Artemis cannot compress its timeline to fit presidential terms. The technical challenges are different, the budget environment is different, and the institutional context is different. A program that began in 2017 and achieves its first landing in 2027 or 2028 will span 3 or 4 presidencies. No single president will receive primary credit, which means no single president has full incentive to prioritize it. The program survives through inertia, through contracts that create congressional constituencies, through the dedication of career civil servants who persist across administrations. This is a weaker foundation than Apollo enjoyed, more vulnerable to budget pressure and political indifference. The gap between Apollo and Artemis is ultimately a product of this structural weakness in American space policy. Other nations with different political systems might maintain continuous capability through continuous investment, their programs insulated from electoral volatility by different institutional arrangements. China's space program operates under a government that does not face competitive elections and can make 50-year plans with reasonable expectation that those plans will be executed. This is not an endorsement of authoritarianism, but rather an observation about how political systems interact with long-duration technical programs. Democracy's strengths in other domains may be weaknesses in the specific domain of sustained spaceflight capability. The cost in dollars is therefore also a cost in time, and the cost in time is also a cost in position. The United States currently leads in space capability, but that lead has narrowed substantially since Apollo's conclusion. China did not exist as a spacefaring nation in 1972. Today China operates a space station in low Earth orbit, has landed rovers on the Moon's far side and near side, has returned lunar samples to Earth, and is developing a crewed lunar landing capability with credible timelines. The gap that Apollo created has been steadily closing while America dithered. Whether this closing gap matters depends on assumptions about the value of space leadership that not everyone shares. Some argue that space is merely another domain for international cooperation. that it matters little which flag is planted first on any given surface so long as humanity as a whole expands outward. Others argue that space represents strategic high ground, that the nation or nations that establish permanent presence beyond Earth will shape the legal and economic frameworks that govern space activities for centuries. Others still argue that the question is premature, that meaningful space presence is decades away regardless of current programs, and that today's expenditures are largely symbolic. These arguments cannot be resolved through cost analysis alone. They involve value judgments about national identity, strategic competition, and human destiny that transcend technical assessment. But the cost analysis establishes the factual foundation on which those value judgments must rest. It demonstrates that the 50-year gap was not free, that capabilities once possessed have proven extraordinarily expensive to rebuild, that the assumption of future cost reduction that justified Apollo's termination has not been validated by subsequent developments. The loss represented by the gap is not merely financial, it is also generational. The engineers who built Apollo are almost entirely gone now. The youngest among them, those who entered the workforce in the late 1960s, are in their 80s. The institutional memory they carried cannot be fully transferred through documentation or training. The specific ways they approached problems, the culture of urgency and excellence that pervaded the Apollo program, these are not artifacts that can be preserved in archives. They existed in living practice and died when that practice ended. The current workforce rebuilding lunar capability is highly skilled and deeply committed. They work with tools and techniques that Apollo engineers could not have imagined. Their computational power, their materials science, their simulation capabilities all vastly exceed what was available in the 1960s. But they lack something that their predecessors possessed, the confidence that comes from having already done what they are attempting. Apollo engineers, by the time they were launching moon missions, had accumulated years of successful experience. They had launched Mercury missions, Gemini missions, Apollo Earth orbit missions. They understood their systems through lived experience, not merely theoretical analysis. They had developed intuitions that proved correct because they had been tested against reality. The Artemis workforce must develop equivalent intuitions without the benefit of equivalent experience. They must validate their systems through testing that can never fully replicate the environment of actual lunar operations. They must confront problems that Apollo solved and rediscover solutions that were once known. This is not their failure. It is the failure of the decades between programs that allowed knowledge to dissipate rather than accumulate. The contrast between what Apollo accomplished and what Artemis struggles to accomplish reveals something profound about the relationship between human ambition and institutional continuity. Great achievements are possible when nations commit fully to their pursuit. But those achievements are not permanent unless the commitment is maintained. The moon landings were not an endpoint. They were a beginning that was abandoned before the implications could be fully developed. The infrastructure built for Apollo could have supported dozens of additional missions, could have evolved into permanent lunar presence, could have established the foundation for journeys beyond the moon. Instead, it was dismantled, its capabilities allowed to decay, its workforce dispersed into other industries. What remains is the memory of what was possible and the slow, expensive work of recovering lost capability. The next Americans to walk on the moon will not be stepping into unknown territory. They will be returning to sites where predecessors walked before them, confronting the preserved evidence of capabilities their nation once possessed and then relinquished. They will see the footprints that have waited for half a century, the equipment that was left behind when the funding disappeared, the silent monuments to decisions that no one intended to become permanent. The cost of the gap is now being paid, instalment by instalment, budget year by budget year, technical milestone by technical milestone. It is a price far higher than anyone anticipated when the decision to end Apollo was made. And it is a price that demonstrates more clearly than any other evidence could what happens when a nation achieves the extraordinary and then chooses not to sustain it. The moon waited. The moon is still waiting. And humanity is still paying the price for having kept it waiting so long. The question that haunts every analysis of the Apollo to Artemis gap is not whether we could have maintained continuous lunar capability. We clearly could have. The Saturn V production lines existed. The workforce was assembled and trained. The infrastructure stood ready for decades of use. The technology, while demanding, was proven and understood. The question is whether we understood, at the moment of decision, what we were choosing to lose. The answer examined honestly, is that we did not. The men who ended Apollo were not fools or villains. They were political leaders facing genuine constraints, balancing competing priorities in a democracy that had never promised eternal commitment to lunar exploration. They looked at the costs of continuing and the costs of stopping, and they made a calculation that seemed reasonable with the information available to them. They assumed that what had been done once could be done again, that capabilities suspended were merely capabilities paused, that the knowledge and infrastructure would somehow remain accessible for future generations who might wish to resume the journey. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong, but recognizing the error does not require condemning those who made it. The nature of complex technological capabilities was not well understood in 1972. The phenomenon now called organizational forgetting had not been studied or documented. The idea that a nation could lose the ability to repeat its greatest achievement seemed counterintuitive, even absurd. How could you forget how to go to the moon? The plans were preserved. The hardware specifications existed in detailed documentation. The fundamental physics had not changed. Surely reconstruction would be straightforward whenever the political will returned. What was not understood, what perhaps could not be understood until it happened, was that the knowledge required for moon missions was not merely technical. It was embedded in human beings, in their relationships, in the culture they had built together, in the thousands of micro-decisions that never appeared in any document, because they were so routine that no one thought to record them. This tacit knowledge, this practiced expertise, was the actual capability. The documents were merely its shadow. Consider what it means to build a rocket engine capable of producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. The F1 engines that powered the Saturn V first stage represented the absolute frontier of human engineering in the 1960s. Each engine burned 3 tons of propellant per second, generating power equivalent to the output of 85 Hoover dams. The combustion chamber reached temperatures exceeding 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while the liquid oxygen pumping through adjacent chambers sat at nearly 300 degrees below zero. The materials had to withstand these extremes simultaneously, mere inches apart for minutes at a time without catastrophic failure. The engineers who designed these engines solved problems that had never been confronted before. They discovered phenomena that existing theory could not predict, and developed solutions through systematic experimentation. When combustion instabilities threatened to tear the engines apart, they developed injection patterns through trial and error, testing hundreds of configurations until they found arrangements that produced stable combustion. The final designs worked, but the engineers who created them would have struggled to fully explain why they worked. They had developed intuitions faster than they could develop theories. The knowledge was in their hands and their judgment, not merely in their documents. When production ended and the workforce dispersed, this knowledge began to decay immediately. The engineers who had solved the combustion instability problem moved on to other projects, their attention shifting to new challenges. The specific insights that had emerged from years of focused work gradually faded from active memory, replaced by whatever problems currently demanded solution. The documentation preserved the final designs, but not the journey that had produced them, not the failed approaches that had revealed what would not work, not the subtle reasoning that distinguished promising directions from dead ends. 2 decades later, when NASA attempted to restart large engine development, engineers discovered that the F1 documentation was simultaneously complete and insufficient. Every specification was recorded, every tolerance was documented, every material was identified. But the new generation of engineers, following these specifications exactly, could not consistently achieve the performance that the original engines had delivered. Something was missing. Some combination of technique and judgment that the original builders had possessed without fully recognizing they possessed it. The reconstruction effort required years of reverse engineering, examining surviving F1 hardware to understand details that the documents did not capture. Engineers discovered that many original components had been hand-fitted by technicians who had developed skills over years of practice. The tolerances in the documents described what was acceptable, not what was optimal. The original technicians had learned through experience exactly how to achieve fits that maximize performance within the acceptable range. This knowledge had never been written down because it seemed too obvious to record. This pattern repeated across virtually every Apollo system. The Block 2 command module that carried astronauts to the moon and back contained thousands of components, each representing specific engineering choices made by specific individuals at specific moments. The documentation recorded what was built but not why alternatives were rejected, not what problems had arisen during development and how they had been solved, not what the engineers had learned that would be relevant for future modifications. Every component embodied accumulated wisdom that evaporated when the people who possessed it moved on to other work. The Artemis program has confronted this reality in ways both expected and surprising. Expected were the challenges of developing new systems, new engines, new spacecraft, new thermal protection. These challenges are formidable but familiar. What has surprised many observers is the difficulty of leveraging Apollo heritage at all. The assumption that modern engineers could simply pick up where their predecessors left off has proven almost entirely wrong. The gap was not a pause, it was a break. The thread of continuous development was severed, and splicing it back together has required essentially starting over while carrying the additional burden of comparison to what was achieved before. The human cost of this discontinuity deserves recognition. The engineers and technicians working on Artemis are among the most talented and dedicated in their fields. They work long hours under intense pressure, knowing that the eyes of history are upon them, knowing that their achievements will be measured against accomplishments completed before most of them were born. They must succeed not merely technically, but symbolically, demonstrating that the capability their nation abandoned can be recovered, that the gap can be bridged, that what was lost can be found again. But they must do this while facing challenges that Apollo engineers never confronted. The political environment has shifted. Sustained commitment cannot be assumed. The budget process has become more contentious. Major programs face cancellation threats with every election cycle. The public's attention, fragmented by endless entertainment options, cannot be captured and held the way network television broadcasts once commanded collective viewing. The cultural moment that made Apollo possible, the combination of Cold War urgency, economic prosperity, and faith in technological progress, has passed and shows no signs of returning. These engineers labour in the shadow of an achievement that has taken on mythic proportions. Apollo has been romanticised in the decades since its conclusion, transformed from a government programme into a symbol of what humanity can accomplish when united in purpose. The actual Apollo program was messy, contentious, plagued by accidents and near disasters, driven as much by political calculation as by idealism. But memory has smoothed these complexities, leaving an image of seamless triumph that no contemporary program can match. The Artemis workforce must compete not with what Apollo actually was, but with what Apollo has become in cultural memory. The psychological burden this creates should not be underestimated. Every delay, every cost overrun, every technical setback is interpreted through the lens of comparison to the past. We did this in 8 years with slide rules, the critics say, and now you need 15 years with supercomputers. The criticism reveals deep misunderstanding of how technological capability actually works, but it shapes public perception nonetheless. The current workforce must develop capabilities that their predecessors possessed, while being constantly reminded that their predecessors possessed them faster and cheaper. The unfairness of this comparison deserves explicit acknowledgement. The Artemis program operates under constraints that Apollo never faced. Environmental review requirements that did not exist in the 1960s add years to development timelines. Safety standards that evolved from the Challenger and Columbia disasters impose costs that Apollo was not required to bear. Supply chains that once were purely domestic now span the globe, creating vulnerabilities and complications that earlier programs avoided. Budget processes that once allowed multi-year commitments now require annual justification and reauthorization. More fundamentally, Artemis must establish not merely the capability to reach the moon, but the capability to remain there sustainably. Apollo was designed as a series of expeditions, brief visits that demonstrated American technological superiority, and then concluded. Artemis aims for something more ambitious, establishing permanent human presence beyond Earth, creating infrastructure that will support ongoing operations, building the foundation for eventual journeys to Mars and beyond. This expanded scope increases complexity dramatically while stretching budgets that would struggle to replicate Apollo's more limited ambitions. The technical challenges of sustainable lunar presence exceed anything Apollo confronted. The missions that landed Americans on the Moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s required astronauts to survive on the surface for a few days at most. The lunar modules carried all necessary supplies and generated power through batteries and fuel cells sufficient for these brief stays. Temperature extremes were managed through careful timing, landing during the lunar morning and departing before conditions became severe. Permanent presence demands solutions that Apollo never needed. Power systems must operate continuously through the 14-day lunar night when solar panels produce nothing. Thermal management must handle both the brutal heat of lunar noon and the cryogenic cold of lunar midnight. Life support systems must recycle water and air rather than carrying all consumables from Earth. Radiation protection must shield inhabitants from cosmic rays and solar particle events over extended periods, rather than merely for the duration of a brief expedition. The lunar poles, where Artemis aims to establish initial infrastructure, present challenges distinct from the equatorial sites where Apollo landed. These locations offer the tantalizing possibility of water ice, impermanently shadowed craters, resources that could dramatically reduce the mass that must be launched from Earth. But they also present difficulties that Apollo planners never addressed. The permanently shadowed regions are among the coldest places in the solar system, where conventional electronics and mechanisms behave in unexpected ways. The illumination conditions that make polar sites attractive for solar power also create navigation challenges as the sun remains perpetually near the horizon, casting long shadows that shift slowly across the landscape. Every one of these challenges is solvable. Human ingenuity, applied with sufficient resources and time, can develop technologies for power, thermal control, life support and radiation protection adequate for long-duration lunar presence. The question is not whether it can be done, but how long it will take and what it will cost. Questions whose answers are shaped fundamentally by the gap that preceded the current program. Had lunar development continued after Apollo, many of these challenges would already be solved. Decades of accumulated experience would have revealed which approaches work and which fail. Incremental improvements, building on established foundations, would have refined systems to higher reliability and lower cost. The current state of lunar capability would represent the leading edge of an ongoing enterprise rather than a reconstruction of abandoned achievements. Instead, engineers must solve these problems essentially from scratch, with only limited ability to build on Apollo heritage. The thermal control systems that worked for 3-day surface stays offer minimal guidance for permanent installations. The power systems that supported short expeditions cannot be scaled to continuous operations. The life support approaches that recycled nothing must be replaced by closed-loop systems that recycle everything. Each of these developments requires the kind of sustained engineering effort that continuous programs would have already completed. The fiscal dimension of the gap reveals its true cost with terrible clarity when examined over the full span of years. The United States has spent, since the final Apollo landing, trillions of dollars on programs that failed to return humans to the Moon. The Space Shuttle program, which consumed approximately $200 billion over its lifetime, was justified partly as a stepping stone toward resumed lunar exploration. It served other purposes, maintaining national prestige in space, supporting scientific research, constructing the International Space Station, but it never fulfilled the promise of reducing costs sufficiently to make lunar return affordable. The Constellation program, cancelled after investing perhaps $20 billion, produced studies and prototypes, but no operational hardware capable of reaching lunar orbit. The combined expenditure on space activities since Apollo ended exceeds the cost of Apollo itself by an enormous margin. Yet at the end of this spending, the United States found itself unable to launch astronauts without purchasing seats on Russian rockets, a humiliating dependence that lasted nearly a decade after the shuttle's retirement. The money spent on intermediate programs that failed to achieve their objectives would have been more than sufficient to maintain continuous lunar capability had that been chosen as the priority. The choice to pursue other approaches, made incrementally over decades by successive administrations and Congresses, accumulated into a decision of historic consequence that no single decision-maker ever explicitly chose. This distributed responsibility makes the gap difficult to address politically. No one bears clear accountability for the 50-year absence from the lunar surface. The decisions that created it were made by officials who are now retired or deceased, responding to pressures that seemed compelling at the time, operating within a political system that structurally discourages long-term commitment. Condemning the past provides neither satisfaction nor guidance. The question that matters now is what lessons can be extracted from the experience and applied to current endeavours. The first lesson, and perhaps the most important, is that great achievements are not self-sustaining. They must be maintained through continuous investment and attention, or they will decay. The assumption that capabilities once demonstrated remain permanently available has been disproven as thoroughly as any assumption in the history of technology. What was done can be undone. What was known can be forgotten. What was built can be lost. The second lesson is that institutional knowledge is fundamentally different from documented knowledge. Writing down what was learned is necessary but not sufficient for preserving the ability to repeat achievements. The practices, the culture, the tacit understanding that enable complex technological systems to function must be transmitted through continuous human activity. When the activity stops, the transmission stops, and the knowledge begins to degrade immediately. The third lesson is that political support for major programs cannot be assumed even when success is demonstrated. The public's attention is finite and shifting. The priorities that seem overwhelming in one era may seem irrelevant in the next. Programs that wish to survive must build constituencies that will advocate for their continuation, must demonstrate ongoing value that justifies continued investment, must become embedded in the political and economic fabric in ways that make termination difficult. The fourth lesson is that delays and pauses have costs that compound over time. The decision to defer lunar return by a decade creates costs that multiply as technology evolves, as workforce ages, as institutional memory fades. The assumption that later is as good as now ignores the reality of how capability degrades when not actively maintained. Every year of the gap made the eventual return more expensive and more difficult. These lessons apply far beyond space exploration. They illuminate something fundamental about the nature of human civilization itself. The achievements of one generation are not automatically inherited by the next. Each generation must choose what to maintain, what to rebuild, what to allow to fade. The accumulated knowledge and capability of humanity exists only because successive generations have chosen to preserve and extend it. When that choice is not made, when convenience or cost or shifting priorities leads to abandonment, the achievements can be lost with startling completeness. The pyramids of Egypt stand as monuments to knowledge that was lost and never recovered. The Romans built concrete that hardened underwater. The formula was lost for centuries. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrated computational capabilities that would not be matched for a millennium. Human history is littered with achievements that were abandoned and then forgotten, capabilities that were developed and then lost, knowledge that was gained and then allowed to slip away. The moon landing gap stands in this lineage. Not the loss of the ability to reach the moon, for that ability is being recovered, but the loss of the continuous development that would have carried humanity much further in the intervening decades. What might have been achieved in those 50 years if the commitment had been sustained? The question invites speculation, but the outlines are not difficult to imagine. A lunar base established in the 1980s, a permanent presence by the 1990s, mining operations extracting resources from the regolith by the early 2000s. Perhaps by now a self-sustaining settlement capable of surviving even if all support from Earth were interrupted. Perhaps the first missions to Mars, launched from lunar orbit where escape velocity is so much lower than from Earth's surface. Perhaps the infrastructure of a truly spacefaring civilization spreading through the inner solar system. These possibilities were not impossible. They were within the reach of the technologies that Apollo had demonstrated, given continuous development over the decades that followed. They would have required sustained commitment of resources at levels comparable to what was actually spent on space programs that failed to achieve them. They would have required political will that proved impossible to maintain. They would have required something that has proven rare in human history, the recognition that achievements must be sustained to remain meaningful. That arrival is not the same as possession. That the moon once reached must be reached again and again, or the reaching becomes merely a memory. The moon still orbits, indifferent to human choices. Its surface preserves the evidence of what was accomplished and abandoned. The footprints undisturbed by any weather, the flags that have faded in unfiltered sunlight, the descent stages that mark where spacecraft landed and astronauts walked. These artifacts wait in the silence, monuments to a capability that was demonstrated and then relinquished, to decisions made for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, to the assumption that what had been done once could be done again whenever desired. The assumption was wrong. The recovery has proven far more difficult and expensive than anyone anticipated. The gap has revealed what discontinuity truly costs, but the recovery is happening. The Artemis program, for all its delays and challenges, is making progress. New spacecraft are being tested, new systems are being validated, new capabilities are being developed that will eventually return human beings to the lunar surface and establish the foundation for permanent presence beyond Earth. The gap will end. Not when anyone originally hoped, not at the cost anyone originally expected, but it will end. When it does, when the next human beings step onto the lunar regolith and look up at the Earth hanging in the black sky, they will carry with them the weight of all the years between. They will walk where others walked before them, following footprints that have waited for their arrival, resuming a journey that was interrupted for longer than most of them have been alive. They will represent not merely American technological capability, but human determination to recover what was lost, to rebuild what was abandoned, to return to what was achieved and then carelessly relinquished. The cost of the gap will follow humanity into space. It will be written in the extra decades required, in the extra billions spent, in the capabilities that were not developed during the long pause. It will be remembered by historians analysing how civilizations sustain their achievements, by engineers studying how knowledge degrades when not actively maintained, by policymakers considering whether to continue or terminate programs whose value will only be realised in the future. But the gap will also end. And when it ends, humanity will stand again on the surface of another world, looking outward toward destinations that await, knowing that the journey suspended can be resumed, that the achievements abandoned can be reclaimed, that the future that was deferred is finally, after all these years, beginning. The moon waited. The moon is still waiting. But not for much longer now. And in that waiting, and in its eventual end, lies the entire story of what humanity has been, what it chose to become, and what it might yet achieve, if it remembers this time not to turn away.